Hey there, tonight we're diving into the cold, hard realities of Christmas in Victorian workhouses, where the closest thing to a festive miracle was finding a plum in your gruel. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Victorian England wasn't exactly the place you'd want to find yourself if you were down on your luck. Sure, it was the era of grand industrial progress, the typewriters, and the steam engines, but it was also the era where the phrase poorhouse wasn't just a metaphorical way to say someone was broke. Enter the workhouses, those infamous institutions that were supposed to be the Victorian safety net, but ended up being more of a barbed wire fence. The whole concept was catapulted into the mainstream thanks to the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act. Now, I know what you're thinking. Amendment Act sounds like a positive spin. Well, not so fast. The act was designed to reduce the cost of looking after the poor and to make the poorhouses less appealing. Not that they were ever particularly appealing, mind you. This legislation essentially turned poverty relief into a deterrent. If you needed help, you'd better brace yourself for a life that was about as cheerful as a Dickens novel on a rainy day. Speaking of Dickens, he didn't pull his punches when it came to describing these institutions. But this isn't just about fiction. The reality was grim enough. Workhouses weren't just about a lack of comfort. They were about stripping dignity. Families were separated upon entry, so if you walked in with a spouse and kids, you'd find yourself living in different parts of the building. The workhouse was the great social equalizer. Everyone was equally miserable. The daily life of a workhouse inmate was a blend of monotony and misery. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. Depending on where you were, your working hours could stretch from dawn till dusk. And the work. Think picking oakum, a delightful task involving unraveling old ropes. It was the kind of job that could drive a person to madness. But hey, at least it kept your fingers busy. Meals were the culinary equivalent of a slap in the face. Gruel, anyone. Maybe a turnip or two if you were feeling fancy. And don't even think about seconds. At this point, you might be wondering about the holiday season. Did Christmas offer a break from this bleak routine? Surely, even the Victorians wouldn't let such a festive occasion go unnoticed, right? Well, sort of. The workhouse Christmas was about as festive as an office party with no music and a cash bar. Yes, there might be a slightly better meal, if you can call a bit more meat and potatoes a feast. There might even be some decorations, but don't expect tinsel and fairy lights. More like a few sprigs of holly to remind you 'tis the season, even if the season felt like a lump of coal. The philosophy behind this approach was simple. Make the workhouse experience so unappealing that only the truly desperate would turn to it. Unfortunately, many had no choice. The combination of industrialization and urbanization had created a perfect storm of poverty. Jobs were scarce, and for those without a trade or family support, the workhouse was the only option. It was a place to survive, certainly not to live. But why did society accept such a harsh system? Well, the 19th century was rife with social and economic changes. The Industrial Revolution was transforming cities, and with it, social attitudes. The belief that poverty was a personal failing rather than a systemic issue was prevalent. The workhouse system was seen as a necessary evil to instill discipline and deter laziness. In reality, it was a band-aid on a gaping wound, a system that punished the vulnerable while barely addressing the root of the problem. Despite its bleakness, the workhouse system did have its defenders. Some argued that it provided shelter and food when there were no alternatives. But let's be real. When your defense is that you're providing the barest minimum for survival, it's a bit like congratulating yourself for not stepping on someone's toes at a crowded dance. As the holiday season rolled around, the contrast between the lives of the rich and the poor became even more pronounced. While the upper classes enjoyed lavish feasts, glittering decorations, and all the trimmings of a Victorian Christmas, the workhouse inmates could only look on from the outside, like kids with their noses pressed against the toy store window. It's the kind of scene that would make even Ebenezer Scrooge say, "All right, that's a bit much." The workhouse Christmas was a reminder that for many, the season of goodwill was just another day in the grind of poverty. Sure, There were well-meaning folks who tried to bring a bit of cheer. Charitable organizations might donate a few extra treats or organize a carol sing. But these gestures were a drop in the ocean. Over time, public opinion began to shift. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the harshness of the workhouse system was increasingly criticized. Reforms were slowly introduced, and by 1929, the workhouses were officially abolished. But their legacy lingered, a dark chapter in the history of social welfare that served as a cautionary tale about the perils of institutionalizing poverty. So, as you cozy up in your modern comforts this holiday season, spare a thought for the Victorian poor. Remember that while the past is often romanticized with images of horse-drawn carriages and snow-dusted streets, the reality was often harsher than any Christmas ghost story. The workhouse system was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's always a glimmer of hope, however dim it may be. But while the Victorians were busy wrapping themselves in a cozy cocoon of Yuletide cheer, the workhouse administrators were knee-deep in a different kind of wrapping, budget spreadsheets. Oh yes, behind the dismal doors of these institutions was a ledger that would make even the most seasoned accountant weep into their abacus. Running a workhouse wasn't just about keeping the poor out of sight, and hopefully out of mind. It was about managing costs with the precision of a tightrope walker juggling flaming torches. Let's dive into the nitty-gritty, shall we? A workhouse budget was a delicate balancing act where every penny counted. In 1834, the year that lovable Poor Law Amendment Act came into play, the average cost of maintaining an inmate was around 3 shillings a week. For our modern ears, that's about £20 or roughly $25. Now, before you think, hey, that's not too shabby, let's break it down. Out of this amount, the bulk went to food, if you could call it that. A typical meal plan included gruel for breakfast, bread and cheese for lunch, and the ever-luxurious broth for dinner. By luxurious, I mean it had the nutritional value of a damp handshake. Housing costs were another expense, albeit one that was curiously low. After all, when you're cramming dozens of people into a room with about as much personal space as a sardine tin, it's not going to break the bank. The Victorian workhouse was the original budget accommodation, just without the complimentary toiletries. And let's not forget clothing. Inmates were given uniforms that made prison garb look like haute couture. These garments were designed for utility, not comfort, and were replaced only when they were more whole than fabric. But let's not be too hard on the poor, pun intended, workhouse administrators. They had to contend with the era's economic realities too. The Great Famine of 1845-1852 and the Industrial Revolution had sent shockwaves through society, creating a surge in poverty and unemployment. Workhouses were often overcrowded, forcing managers to stretch their budgets thinner than a Victorian mustache wax, with funding coming from local taxes, which were about as popular as a wet blanket at a bonfire. It was a constant struggle to keep the lights on, literally. Now, let's add a little salt to this financial wound. Compare these costs with the lavish spending of the era's upper crust. A single Victorian upper-class dinner party could easily cost upwards of £100, equivalent to about £10, 000 or $12, 500 today. That's enough to cover the weekly expenses of several hundred workhouse inmates. Priorities right. It's like watching someone buy a gold-plated yacht while the ship's crew is stuck rowing with teaspoons. And yet, despite the Dickensian gloom, there was still an occasional flicker of hope. Some workhouses made attempts, however feeble, to improve conditions. In the 1860, workhouses like St. Pancras in London started to experiment with dietary improvements, adding a bit more substance to the inmates' meals. But these changes were sporadic and often depended on the whims of the Board of Guardians. Basically, the era's version of a reality TV judge panel, but with more waistcoats and fewer catchphrases. Let's not forget the social experiment aspect of these institutions. Workhouses were essentially the government's way of saying, hey, let's see if we can solve poverty by making it as unappealing as possible. It was a system designed to deter dependency, but in practice, it often punished those who had no other options. Think of it as the world's least fun escape room. No clues, no support, just a relentless reminder that society had turned its back on you. So, what can we glean from this grim financial tale? Well, for one, it's a sobering reminder of how far we've come, or haven't, depending on your perspective, when it comes to social welfare. The Victorian workhouse budget was a testament to the era's harsh realities, a ledger filled with cold numbers that failed to capture the human cost of institutionalized poverty. While we may chuckle at the absurdities of the past, it's worth remembering that behind every penny saved, there was a life that could barely afford to be lived. And as we peel back the layers of this historical onion, don't be surprised if it brings a tear to your eye, not just from the numbers, but from the stories they tell. So, as we stand on the precipice of yet another chapter in the saga of Victorian workhouses, let's dive headfirst into the murky waters of political maneuvering and social attitudes that shaped these institutions. It's a tale as complex as a Victorian gentleman's mustache, and just as twisted. First, let's talk politics, the kind of politics that would make Machiavelli smirk. The Industrial Revolution was a seismic shift, and not just because of all the coal dust clogging the air. It uprooted traditional ways of life, sending waves of rural workers into the cities in search of employment. Picture a conveyor belt of humanity, churning out laborers like a factory spews out widgets. The result? Overcrowded cities, rife with poverty and unemployment. This was fertile ground for the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, a piece of legislation that was supposed to streamline poverty relief, but ended up being about as compassionate as a crocodile in a chicken coop. The Poor Law Amendment Act centralized relief efforts under the new Poor Law Commission, aiming to cut costs and discourage reliance on public assistance. But here's where the PR spin comes in. Official reports painted these workhouses as benevolent institutions where the poor could find refuge. In reality, they were more like a dystopian experiment in social engineering. The idea was to make the workhouse so unappealing that only the truly desperate would enter. It's a bit like setting up a free gym membership that only includes burpees and no showers. Technically available, but not exactly enticing. Public perception of the workhouses was a mixed bag, and by mixed, I mean it was generally filled with disdain and fear. The Victorian middle class viewed poverty as a moral failing. Think of it as the social equivalent of blaming the victim for their own misfortune. This attitude was reflected in the design of the workhouses themselves, which were intentionally austere. The architecture screamed institution more than sanctuary, with its high walls and barred windows. It was a visual testament to the societal belief that poverty needed to be contained, much like a contagious disease. The Industrial Revolution, for all its technological marvels, also fueled this perception. As factories and mechanization took over, the value of individual labor diminished. Workers were reduced to mere cogs in the industrial machine, easily replaceable, and therefore easily neglected. The result was a society that prioritized economic efficiency over human dignity. This was captured in the words of one contemporary critic who noted, "The workhouse is a place where the poor are housed, not helped." Let's take a moment to debunk some myths about Victorian philanthropy. While tales of benefactors distributing Christmas turkeys to workhouse inmates make for heartwarming stories, they were more the exception than the rule. Reality was that charitable acts were often driven by self-interest or social pressure. It wasn't uncommon for the wealthy to donate to workhouses to boost their own social standing. Think of it as the Victorian version of a social media influencer's charity post, more about optics than altruism. Yet, there were genuine efforts to reform the system, albeit slowly. By the mid to late 19th century, the harsh conditions of workhouses began to draw public criticism. People started questioning why the poor should be punished for circumstances beyond their control. It was a glacial shift in attitude, but a shift nonetheless. The writings of social reformers like Charles Booth and Seabohm Rowntree, who highlighted the systemic nature of poverty, played a crucial role in changing public perception. Their research showed that poverty was often a result of low wages and lack of employment opportunities, not personal failings. This was a revelation akin to discovering that the earth wasn't flat, mind-blowing for its time. Despite these small steps forward, the workhouses remained a stark reminder of Victorian society's failings. They were a microcosm of the era's contradictions, a place where charity and punishment were two sides of the same coin. The Poor Law Commissioners, in their reports, often emphasized the humanitarian aspect of workhouses, claiming they provided necessary care for the destitute. But if we peeked behind the curtain, we find a reality that was less about care and more about control. The disparity between official reports and lived experiences is best illustrated by the words of the inmates themselves. One anonymous inmate wrote in a letter smuggled out of a workhouse, "We live not like humans but like animals, penned in, fed scraps, and left to rot." It's the kind of first-hand account that strips away any veneer of benevolence, laying bare the harsh truths of life inside. As we continue to peel back the layers of this historical onion, remember that the workhouses were not just relics of the past, but a reflection of the social and political forces that shaped an entire era. They were the embodiment of a society grappling with the rapid changes brought by industrialization, struggling to find a balance between progress and humanity. The lessons they offer are as relevant today as they were a century ago, serving as a cautionary tale of what happens when economic efficiency trumps human empathy. In the upcoming parts, we'll explore how these insights paved the way for reform and what finally led to the demise of the workhouse system. For now, it's enough to recognize that the story of Victorian workhouses is more than just a historical footnote. It's a mirror reflecting the complexities and contradictions of an era that, for better or worse, laid the groundwork for the modern world. So, as we waltz further into the story, let's address the elephant in the Victorian parlour, Christmas in the workhouse. If you've ever imagined these institutions as Dickensian wonderlands filled with merry carolers and overflowing puddings, prepare to have your visions dashed like a Christmas tree in a snowstorm. The myth of the workhouse Christmas is a curious concoction of romantic nostalgia and selective memory. Sure, there were moments of attempted cheer, but they were often as thin as the gruel served year-round. Picture this. While the upper crust of society was feasting on goose and guzzling mulled wine, workhouse inmates could look forward to a meal that might include a slice of meat and a smidgen of potatoes. A Christmas miracle, more like a festive afterthought. Now, let's dig into the feast itself. A typical workhouse Christmas dinner consisted of a piece of meat, beef, if you were lucky, accompanied by potatoes and maybe a splash of gravy. It was a step up from the usual fare, but calling it a banquet would be like calling a drizzle a hurricane. Dessert might be a plum pudding, but let's not get carried away. This wasn't the rich, steaming pudding of Victorian lore. It was more likely a dense, underwhelming lump that could double as a doorstop. Decorations, you ask? Well, don't expect a winter wonderland. A sprig of holly here, a bit of mistletoe there, and maybe a few paper chains if someone was feeling particularly festive. It was more of a nod to the holiday than a full embrace. The atmosphere was strictly utilitarian. Think more Yuletide in a utilitarian dystopia than Christmas in a cozy cottage. And what about those carolers? Ah, the romantic image of rosy-cheeked singers spreading joy through song. In reality, many workhouse residents were too exhausted and demoralized to muster much enthusiasm. Singing might have happened, but it was hardly the joyous hallelujah chorus, more like a reluctant attempt to inject a bit of spirit into an otherwise dreary day. The regulations surrounding Christmas in workhouses were as rigid as the institutions themselves. Activities were monitored, interactions scrutinized, and any notion of familial warmth was quickly stamped out. If you were hoping for a heartwarming reunion scene, think again. The separation of families meant that the closest you might get to a family gathering was a glimpse of a loved one across the courtyard, like star-crossed lovers in a particularly bleak play. Charitable acts did make an appearance, though often more for the giver's benefit than the receiver's. Donors might provide a few extra treats or organize a carol sing, but these gestures were drops in an ocean of need. It was the Victorian version of performative charity, socially beneficial for the giver, minimally impactful for the recipient. The wealthy would often make a show of their generosity, visiting workhouses and distributing gifts. But for all their magnanimous intentions, these visits were fleeting, and the relief they provided was as temporary as a snowflake in a thaw. Now, let's be fair. Not every workhouse was a pit of despair. Some administrators genuinely tried to improve conditions, and there were instances of true kindness and charity. But these were exceptions, not the rule. The broader system was designed to deter dependency, not to celebrate the spirit of giving. The harsh reality was that, for many, Christmas in the workhouse was just another day in a cycle of poverty. The disparity between the festive cheer outside and the grim reality inside was stark. It was as if the season of goodwill stopped at the workhouse gates, leaving the residents to watch the world celebrate from afar. But hold onto your stockings, because there is more to this tale. As we inch closer to the end of the 19th century, public sentiment began to shift. The Victorian workhouse, once seen as a necessary evil, started to come under scrutiny. Critics argued that the system was less about providing aid and more about maintaining social order at the expense of human dignity. The winds of reform were blowing, albeit slowly, and the workhouse system was beginning to wobble on its foundations. So, as we pause to catch our breath in this narrative, remember that the story of the workhouse Christmas is one of contrast, a tale of romanticized nostalgia clashing with stark reality. It serves as a reminder that even in the most festive of seasons, there can be shadows lurking just out of sight. And as we move forward, we'll explore how these shadows eventually gave way to the dawn of change. Stay tuned, because the story of the workhouse has more twists and turns than a Christmas cracker joke. And so, as the shadows began to dissipate under the scrutiny of reform, the Victorian workhouse system found itself teetering on the edge of a historical abyss. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it a growing recognition that poverty was not merely a moral failing, but a societal challenge demanding systemic solutions rather than punitive measures. The workhouses, once the grim emblem of social order, were now under siege by reformers wielding the sharp sword of public opinion and the blunt hammer of legislative change. The first cracks in the workhouse facade appeared as early as the 1870, with the introduction of the Public Health Act of 1875, which pivoted the focus toward improving living conditions rather than merely containing poverty. The act was a significant stride, acknowledging that a healthy population was a productive one. It was a radical notion that perhaps, just perhaps, people deserved to live in conditions that didn't resemble a Charles Dickens fever dream. By the early 20th century, the tide had turned decisively against the workhouse system. The Local Government Act of 1929 finally put the nail in the coffin, transferring responsibilities for poor relief from the dreaded poor law guardians to county and borough councils. It was a bureaucratic shuffle, sure, but one that signified a massive shift in how society viewed and treated its most vulnerable members. Workhouses were gradually phased out, their inmates transferred to more humane institutions, and the buildings repurposed for other uses. Some were turned into hospitals, others into housing or community centers, a fitting transformation from places of despair to centers of care. Now, as we sift through the rubble of this institutional collapse, let's reflect on the legacy of the Victorian workhouse. In its heyday, the workhouse was both a symbol of society's attempt to grapple with poverty and a stark reminder of its failure to do so with compassion. It taught us that charity, while noble, is not a substitute for systemic change. The workhouse system was charity's dark doppelganger, offering aid with one hand while wielding a stick with the other. The lessons of the workhouse era continue to echo in modern debates about welfare and social support. The emphasis on deterrence and moral judgment that characterized the Victorian approach is a cautionary tale against policies that prioritize fiscal efficiency over human dignity. It's a reminder that when we design systems to help the needy, our focus should be on empowerment and opportunity, not on punishment and shame. But why do Victorian Christmas myths still hold their allure? Perhaps it's because they offer a comforting narrative amidst the harsh realities of history. The image of a snowy London street, twinkling with gaslights and filled with carolers, is infinitely more appealing than the grim truth of workhouse life. It's the same reason we love a good Dickens novel, romanticized as they are. They allow us to confront the harshness of the past while wrapped in the warmth of a fictional world. The Dickensian themes of redemption and goodwill resonate because they speak to a fundamental human desire for hope and transformation. Even in the bleakest settings, the possibility of change and kindness shines through like a beacon. It's the reason Ebenezer Scrooge's transformation from miser to benefactor remains a powerful narrative, reminding us that empathy and generosity can transcend even the most entrenched systems of inequality. In the end, the Victorian workhouse is a historical paradox, a place of suffering that inadvertently fostered the seeds of reform. Its story is a testament to the endurance of human spirit and the relentless pursuit of a more equitable society. As we cozy up in our modern comforts, sipping eggnog by the fire, let's remember the lessons of the past. Let's strive to create a world where the spirit of Christmas, kindness, compassion, and community extends beyond the festive season, transforming not just our holidays, but our everyday lives. And so, as you drift off to sleep with visions of sugar plums and historical insights dancing in your head, remember this: the workhouse is gone, but its legacy lives on in the ongoing struggle for social justice. It's a saga of progress and pitfalls, of myths and realities, and most importantly, of the enduring power of human empathy. Sleep tight, and may your dreams be filled with the promise of a better tomorrow. Your eyes blink open to a gloom that's a few shades brighter than the inside of your eyelids. Welcome to medieval Iceland, around the year 1000 AD, where mornings are less about chirping birds and more about the relentless howling of the wind. The first thing you'll notice is the damp chill seeping through the turf walls of your home. Yes, your cozy medieval abode is essentially a grassy hobbit hole without the magic. It's a one-room turf house, and while it's an engineering marvel for its time, it's not exactly what you'd call a fixer-upper by today's standards. The roof is made of, you guessed it, turf. That's right. Your house is a glorified dirt sandwich, with layers of stone and wood forming the bread. These homes were designed to withstand Iceland's brutal elements, which is a polite way of saying they keep you from freezing your toes off. But let's not get too romantic here. There's a reason modern Icelanders live in houses with central heating, and not in these drafty mounds of earth. Now, your morning routine doesn't involve a leisurely scroll through social media with a cup of artisanal coffee. Instead, you're greeted by the harsh reality of subsistence living. The economy here is as rugged as the landscape, largely based on farming, sheep herding, and fishing. You're not exactly making it rain with gold coins. You're just trying not to starve. Stepping outside, you're hit by the crisp air that feels more like a slap than a gentle breeze. The landscape is a volcanic wonderland, full of jagged rocks and sparse vegetation. It's beautiful in that stark, desolate kind of way, like a postcard from a place you're glad you don't actually live. But the brutal winters and fleeting summers aren't just setting the scene. They're dictating every aspect of your life. The weather is your boss, and a demanding one at that. Winters are long and unforgiving, while summers are a blink-and-you-miss-it affair. The growing season is as short as a teenager's attention span, which means you're constantly playing catch-up with nature. You're not just farming, you're engaged in a high-stakes game of survival. Speaking of farming, let's talk about the economy. Iceland's not known for its lush fields and abundant crops. No, it's more like a rocky outpost where you coax a living from the soil through sheer determination and a bit of luck. Sheep are your bread and butter, and by butter, I mean wool, milk, and meat. They are the real MVPs here, and you'd better believe you're counting on them to see you through winter. Fishing is another mainstay, though it's not the picturesque endeavor you might imagine. Forget leisurely casting a line into a tranquil pond. We're talking battling the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Your boat is a simple wooden affair, and your fishing gear is rudimentary at best. It's a tough gig, but you don't have many options. Fish aren't just dinner. They're a currency of sorts, traded and bartered to get what you can't produce yourself. Now, if you think you're going to take a leisurely stroll through the countryside, think again. The terrain is unforgiving, and distances are deceiving. A simple trip to a neighboring farm can take hours or even days, depending on the weather and your stamina. There's no Uber horse to whisk you away. What about entertainment, you ask? Let's just say Netflix hasn't made it to Iceland yet. Your evenings are spent huddled around a smoky fire, listening to sagas recited by a local skald. These stories of gods, heroes, and epic battles are the medieval equivalent of binge-watching your favorite series, but with a lot more creative exaggeration and a lot less CGI. So, as you pull on your woolen tunic and prepare to brave the elements, remember that while medieval Iceland might look idyllic in hindsight, living here is a test of grit and endurance. You're not just surviving a day, you're living a whole lifestyle shaped by the harsh realities of nature and the relentless passage of time. And if you're still romanticizing this life, just wait until winter really sets in. As you pull on that woolen tunic and brace yourself for another day in medieval Iceland, let's dive into what's really on your to-do list. Spoiler alert, it's not sipping lattes at a quaint cafe. First, get ready for a crash course in medieval technology, where a high-tech gadget is anything more advanced than a rock. Start with your tools, which are about as basic as it gets. We're talking axes, knives, and wooden plows, nothing that would dazzle a modern-day Home Depot shopper. These tools are handmade, often from iron and wood, and while they might not win any innovation awards, they get the job done. Axes are your best friend here, not just for chopping wood, but for building, hunting, and any other activity you can think of that involves swinging a sharp object. And let's not forget the trusty scythe, essential for cutting hay in the blink and you'll miss it summer. Now, let's talk plumbing, or the glaring lack thereof. Forget flushing toilets and running showers. You're dealing with chamber parts and icy streams here. Bathing is more of an occasional event than a daily ritual, so your medieval scent is something to behold, or rather to avoid. But hey, everyone else smells the same, and there's a certain camaraderie in communal discomfort. Speaking of discomfort, let's move on to what's fueling your body, the medieval Icelandic diet. It's a culinary journey best described as utilitarian. Fish is the star of the show, and you better like it, because you're eating it in every conceivable form. Dried, fermented, smoked, you name it. If it can be done to a fish, you're doing it. And don't even think about coffee or chocolate. Those luxuries are centuries away from reaching your taste buds. Instead, you're downing a lot of whey, barley bread, and skyer, a dairy product that's like yogurt, but without the fruit on the bottom appeal. Fresh fruit. Forget about it. The harsh climate doesn't exactly lend itself to orchards and fields of strawberries. Instead, you might get your hands on some berries or wild herbs during the fleeting summer months, but that's about it. It's a carb-heavy, protein-packed menu that's less about taste and more about survival. Your ancestors didn't have the luxury of being picky eaters. They ate what was available and thanked the Norse gods for every bite. Now, while you're munching on your dried fish breakfast, let's dive into the social scene. Spoiler, it's not exactly buzzing with drama, but it's got its own brand of intrigue. The social structure is a bit of a free-for-all, with no centralized government to call the shots. Instead, it's all about family alliances and the cunning diplomacy of the chieftains, or Garthar. These guys are the local power brokers, managing disputes and maintaining a semblance of order through a complex web of allegiances and favors. Think of Garthar as the medieval Icelandic version of small-town mayors, but with more swagger and a penchant for saga-worthy storytelling. They're the glue holding together a society that's more akin to a loosely bound book than a tight-knit community. If you're looking to climb the social ladder, cozying up to a Gothi, or better yet, marrying into their family, is your best bet. Family alliances are your currency in this world, almost as valuable as the sheep you're relying on for sustenance. Marriages are strategic affairs, less about romance and more about strengthening ties and securing resources. You're not swiping right for love, you're negotiating terms for survival. As you plod through your chores, it's worth considering the bigger picture. The absence of a centralized government might sound like a libertarian dream, but it means you're constantly navigating a landscape of shifting loyalties and potential conflicts. There's a reason the Icelandic sagas are filled with tales of feuds and bloodshed. When everyone's trying to be the big fish in a small pond, things can get messy. So, as you go about your day, whether it's tending to livestock, mending tools, or negotiating alliances, remember that life in medieval Iceland is a test of endurance and adaptability. It's a world where technology is rudimentary, the diet is dictated by necessity, and social bonds are your lifeline. And while we might romanticize the rugged simplicity of it all, living here is not for the faint of heart. It's a delicate dance between survival and tradition, where every choice could tip the scales in a land where the only constant is change. As you trudge through the daily grind, let's pivot to a midday rendezvous with medieval Icelandic justice, a system as unique as it is unruly. Welcome to the Althing, the granddaddy of all parliaments, where law and order are served with a side of chaos and a splash of Norse audacity. Picture this: hundreds of chieftains, farmers, and free folk gathered at Thingvellir, a scenic but stark rift valley, to hash out disputes and legislate like it's 999. Forget the gavel and black robes. This outdoor assembly is more Viking festival than courtroom drama. The Althing isn't about law books or due process. It's a rollicking mix of debate, consensus, and occasionally a well-placed axe. This is where Iceland's free-spirited independence really shines. With no king or central authority, the island's residents rely on a rough and ready form of democracy that's more about shouting matches than silent judgment. The All Things Heart is the Law Rock, a natural outcrop where the law speaker, a human Wikipedia of legal knowledge, recites the laws from memory. Why memorize them? Well, in a place where the written word is as rare as tropical vacations, oral tradition is king. The law speaker holds the gig for 3 years, during which he essentially becomes Iceland's walking, talking legal code. Consider it the ultimate test of public speaking and memory, no pressure. So how does justice work here? With a blend of negotiation, compensation, and a dash of drama. Disputes are settled not by juries, but by panels of chieftains who weigh the evidence and decide on fines, known as bard. Got a problem with your neighbor? Expect to haggle over livestock or silver, not serve time in a dungeon. It's a system built on consensus, or at least enough nods of agreement to avoid a blood feud. Speaking of blood, let's talk outlawry. If you're deemed too unruly for even this lenient system, you might find yourself an outlaw. Essentially, a medieval do-not-pass-go card. Outlawry means you're no longer under the law's protection, turning every man's hand against you. It's the ultimate form of social exile, and a solid motivation to play nice. Egil Skallagrimsson, the infamous poet-warrior, danced on the edge of this fate, his saga filled with enough blood and brawn to make HBO drool. Egil's tale is a prime example of how sagas capture the gritty, unvarnished realities of Norse life. These stories aren't just entertainment. They're the medieval equivalent of historical records, political commentary, and family gossip rolled into one. Through Egil's exploits, we glimpse the raw, unfiltered grit of a society where personal honor often trumps communal peace. So, why does this matter? Because it shows a world where survival hinges not just on battling the elements, but also on navigating a complex web of social ties and legal loopholes. The All Thing is a microcosm of Icelandic life, an arena where alliances are forged, disputes are aired, and reputations are won or lost. It's a system that values personal responsibility and community consensus, even if it occasionally devolves into a brawl. In the grand scheme of things, the All Thing represents a society that refuses to be tamed by the harsh realities of its environment. It's a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of a people who, despite, or perhaps because of, their isolation, carved out a functioning, albeit chaotic, legal system. As you navigate this rugged world, remember that while medieval Iceland might lack the comforts of modern life, it's rich in stories, sagas, and the spirit of self-governance. Now, as you step away from the All Things' lively debates and head back to your turf house, consider the weight of history beneath your feet. You're walking through a landscape that has witnessed centuries of human struggle and triumph, where every rock and rift tells a story. It's a place where lore and legend intertwine, shaping a society that's as rugged and resilient as the land itself. And as you ponder the tales of Egil and his ilk, remember that these stories are more than just echoes of the past. They're reflections of the human condition, of our eternal dance with fate, freedom, and the forces that bind us together. So, while you might not last a day in this medieval world, you can certainly appreciate the legacy of those who did. Here in Iceland, history is alive, breathing in the windswept valleys and etched into the saga-steeped soil. And as the sun begins to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the landscape, you realize that the day's lessons are far from over. As the sun dips behind the rugged Icelandic horizon, casting shadows that stretch like long-forgotten legends, you realize your day in medieval Iceland is far from over. The afternoon's agenda, stocking up on resources for the bone-chilling winter, a task that is as essential as it is arduous. Welcome to the Viking version of prepping, where your survival hinges on your ability to outwit the elements and stash enough supplies to make it through the dark months. But before you get too comfy imagining a quaint harvest scene, let's set the record straight. This is no bucolic romp through verdant fields. Instead, you're facing a landscape that's more Game of Thrones than Little House on the Prairie. Iceland's geography is a Gothic tapestry of volcanic rock, glaciers and fjords. It's a land as stark as a black and white photo, yet undeniably captivating. This rugged terrain has a knack for shaping its inhabitants into tenacious survivors, molding them in its own image. So, what's on your medieval to-do list? First up, gathering firewood. Forget neatly stacked logs. Think more like scavenging for driftwood along Iceland's rocky shores. Timber is as scarce as a warm summer breeze here, and every piece you collect feels like a small victory against the encroaching cold. You'll need enough to keep your hearth burning through an Icelandic winter, which feels longer than your last Netflix binge. Spoiler, it's going to take more than a few twigs to stave off frostbite. Next, you're off to check on your sheep, not just fluffy lawn mowers, but your lifeline. These woolly wonders provide everything from clothing to sustenance. They're about as valuable as a modern-day stock portfolio. You'll shear, milk, and fatten them up, all with an eye towards surviving the winter months. It's a high-stakes game of animal husbandry, where the wrong move could mean the difference between a cozy winter and a desperate hunt for food. Meanwhile, the geographical isolation of Iceland is both a boon and a bane. On one hand, it shields you from marauding invaders and the chaos of continental power struggles. On the other, it makes trade and travel a Herculean task. Picture this, traversing long distances over a landscape that seems designed to trip you at every turn, with weather that switches moods faster than a caffeinated toddler. Trading goods like wool, fish, and the occasional polar bear pelt. Yes, really, with neighboring settlements or even distant lands, involves navigating treacherous waters and rugged trails. Enter the Viking longship, your noble steed across the North Atlantic. These sleek vessels are the Ferraris of the medieval world, expertly crafted for speed and agility. Still, even the finest ship can't control the temperamental sea, which has a mind of its own. A journey that should take days can stretch into weeks, thanks to storms, icebergs, or simply the whims of the wind. But the real kicker, by the year 1000, Iceland has adopted Christianity, and the cultural tectonic plates are shifting beneath your feet. The new religion is spreading like wildfire, bringing with it a host of changes that ripple through society. Church bells start to chime where once there were only the sounds of Norse chants. The adoption of Christianity isn't just a spiritual shift. It's a political maneuver designed to align Iceland with the rest of Christian Europe, keeping it safe from the wrath of zealous crusaders and opportunistic kings. Yet, the transition isn't seamless. Tensions simmer between the Old Norse pagan practices and the new Christian norms. It's a cultural tug-of-war that leaves many scratching their heads or sharpening their swords. You've got folks who still swear by Thor and Odin, alongside those embracing the teachings of Christ. This uneasy coexistence plays out in everyday life, where pagan rituals mingle with Christian rites. Imagine a Sunday service followed by a rowdy feast where the old gods are toasted in secret. It's a spiritual mashup that makes for interesting dinner conversation, if nothing else. The political landscape is equally complex. Chieftains, previously loyal to the old gods, now seek to strengthen their power by aligning with the church. The Garthar, those swaggering chieftains who once held sway over all matters local and legal, now find themselves navigating a new world order where bishops and priests wield influence. The church, with its promises of salvation and eternal life, offers a different kind of power, one that's less about brawn and more about belief. So why does this religious shake-up matter? Because it's more than just a change of faith. It's a redefinition of identity. The Icelanders, fiercely independent and rooted in tradition, are now part of a broader Christian community. It's a shift that alters alliances, reshapes politics, and even influences the sagas that will be penned by future generations. The tales of gods and heroes give way to stories of saints and sinners, as the island's cultural tapestry is rewoven with threads of both old and new. As you mull over these changes, the sun sinks lower, casting a golden hue over the volcanic landscape. The day isn't done, and neither are your reflections. In a land where survival is a constant battle against nature and time, the adoption of Christianity adds another layer to the complex mosaic of Icelandic life. It's a reminder that even in the harshest environments, human society is never static. It's a living, breathing entity, constantly evolving in response to the world around it. And as you gather your firewood and tend to your sheep, you realize that the challenges faced by medieval Icelanders are not so different from those we encounter today. It's a world where geography shapes destiny, where belief systems collide and converge, and where survival depends on resilience and adaptability. The rugged beauty of Iceland, with its stark landscapes and rich history, serves as both a backdrop and a catalyst for these timeless human dramas. As you head back to your turf house, the air filled with the scent of the sea and the promise of winter, you can't help but feel a connection to those who walked this land 1,000 years ago, navigating the same challenges, dreaming the same dreams, and writing their own chapters in the saga of life. But as the evening sky fades to a tapestry of indigo and stars, casting a celestial spotlight on the rugged terrain, you find yourself drawn to the heart of Icelandic culture, its sagas and poetry. These are not just stories to pass the long, bitter nights, but vital threads that weave the fabric of a society connected by shared ancestry and collective memory. Here, in this land of fire and ice, where geography dictates survival, stories are the lifeblood that sustains the spirit. Let's tackle the myth first, the romanticized Viking life. Thanks to pop culture, we've all been fed a diet of horned helmets and endless raids. But here's the kicker, those helmets, pure fiction. Not a single horned helmet has surfaced from Viking archaeological digs. And while the sagas do recount epic voyages and fierce battles, they're less about a life of endless adventure and more about the drudgery, the endurance, and the very human struggles of the Norse people. The real stars of medieval Iceland are the skalds, those poets and storytellers with the oral prowess to make a Netflix writer envious. They were the keepers of history, the bards who could turn the mundane into the monumental. Imagine trying to memorize and recite the equivalent of a 250-page novel without a single sticky note. That's the level of commitment we're talking about. These stories, passed down from memory to memory, eventually found their way onto vellum in the 13th century. That's right, vellum made from calfskin, not your garden variety paper. It's an expensive medium, costing about 2-3 sheep per book, but worth it to immortalize the sagas. Works like the Asterisk saga of the Icelanders Asterisk and the Asterisk Poetic Edda Asterisk are not just literary achievements, they're cultural cornerstones. They capture the ethos of a people resilient in the face of adversity, their tales woven with threads of bravery, betrayal, and the ever-present struggle with fate. Economically, Iceland was no medieval metropolis. Its economy was a study in scarcity, relying on sheep, fish, and a bit of trade here and there. But what it lacked in material wealth, it made up for in cultural riches. The sagas were more than entertainment. They were a means of preserving laws, customs, and the very identity of the Icelandic people. In a world without written records, they were a living library, preserving the past for future generations. Now, while you're probably picturing a cozy fireside gathering, the reality might be less idyllic. The turf house, with its smoky hearth and the scent of drying fish, isn't exactly a plush theatre. Yet, it's the perfect setting for these stories, the flickering flames casting shadows that dance in time with the storyteller's words. It's a scene that's both intimate and communal, a reminder that even in the harshest environments, humans seek connection and meaning. But let's not get too swept up in the romance of it all. Life in medieval Iceland was tough, a constant battle against the elements. The sagas themselves reflect this stark reality, with tales of blood feuds and survival against the odds. They're not sanitized bedtime stories, but raw, unflinching accounts of a society where personal honor often came at a steep price. Take the saga of Grettir the Strong, a tale of a larger-than-life outlaw whose defiance of fate and law makes for gripping narrative, and a reminder of the precarious balance between heroism and hubris. So, where does this leave us? For one, it's clear that the Viking Age was as much about endurance as it was about exploration. The sagas, with their blend of myth and reality, offer a window into a world where the boundaries between legend and life were as blurred as the horizon on a stormy Icelandic sea. As you prepare to turn in for the night, nestled within the earthy walls of your turf house, take a moment to reflect on the legacy of these medieval Icelanders. They carved out a society against all odds, using the tools of oral tradition and adaptability to thrive in an unforgiving landscape. Their sagas continue to captivate us, not just because of their tales of guards and warriors, but because they speak to the enduring human spirit, the desire to make sense of the world, to leave a mark, and to connect with those who came before and those who will come after. In the end, while you might not last a day in this world, you can certainly appreciate the tenacity and creativity that allowed a society to flourish in such a challenging environment. The sagas are not just relics of the past. They're a testament to the power of storytelling, a universal thread that binds us all, regardless of time or place. And as you drift off to sleep, the echoes of those ancient tales mingling with the whispers of the wind, you find yourself grateful for the shared human journey, one where stories light the way and history continues to unfold with each passing day. December 6, 1941, in Pearl Harbor was the kind of day that seemed tailor-made for postcards. The sun shone with all the subtlety of a spotlight, casting its warm glow over the Hawaiian Islands, and the gentle hum of daily routines filled the air. You were stationed here, right in the heart of paradise, where palm trees swayed like lazy metronomes and waves whispered a soft, rhythmic lullaby. Yet, beneath this serene facade, a tempest brewed on the geopolitical horizon, unseen by the soldiers who went about their tasks with little suspicion of the chaos to come. Geographically, Hawaii was the linchpin in the Pacific, a strategic gem that the U.S. military clutched tightly. Nearly 400 miles from the U.S. mainland, and about 4,000 miles from Japan, these islands were the perfect middle ground for projecting power across the vast ocean. Pearl Harbor was the crown jewel of this strategic setup, a natural deepwater port transformed into a bustling naval base. It was home to the Pacific Fleet, a flotilla of battleships, destroyers, and aircraft ready to flex American muscle in the region. And here you were, nestled among these steel giants, perhaps unaware that this very position painted a target on your back. The daily life on the base was regimented, yet somehow relaxing, a contradiction only military life could provide. Reveille sounded at the crack of dawn, a not-so-gentle reminder that even paradise had a morning shift. Soldiers like you bustled about, maintaining ships, conducting drills, or enjoying a rare day off with a game of baseball or a dip in the ocean. The officers, on the other hand, were busy with paperwork, planning maneuvers, and of course, keeping an eye on the political clouds gathering over the Pacific. And boy, were those clouds ominous. The political tension between the United States and Japan was tighter than a sailor's knot. It was an economic standoff for the ages. The U.S., wielding its economic power like a club, had imposed sanctions on Japan, cutting off essential materials like oil and steel. Japan, with its imperial ambitions and a thirst for resources, viewed these sanctions as a stranglehold. Diplomacy seemed more like a high-stakes poker game, each side bluffing while holding a pair of deuces. In the summer of 1941, the U.S. had frozen Japanese assets, a move that was less about financial prudence and more a strategic slap in the face. This freeze was part of a broader strategy to curb Japan's aggressive expansion into China and Southeast Asia. The diplomatic talks that followed were a series of polite exchanges laced with underlying threats. By autumn, these talks had broken down completely. Japan was left with two choices: retreat and lose face in the international arena or strike, and hope to force a favorable negotiation. This tension seeped into the daily lives of those stationed at Pearl Harbor. Rumors swirled like dust devils. Whispers of potential attacks floated through the ranks, but they were often dismissed as the product of overactive imaginations. After all, an attack on Pearl Harbor, that was as far-fetched as a Hollywood script. The U.S. was a sleeping giant, and who in their right mind would dare to wake it? Yet, even in these dismissals lay a kernel of truth, a subconscious acknowledgement that danger was lurking just out of sight. Your commanding officers probably held briefings, warning of possible Japanese aggression, but specifics were as elusive as a mirage. Intelligence was a mixed bag, often more confusing than clarifying. Messages and warnings were lost in translation or buried under bureaucratic piles, a tragic comedy of errors that would later become the stuff of infamy. But today, December 6, the mood was still one of cautious optimism. After all, tomorrow was another day, and surely it would be just as peaceful as today. As evening descended, the base settled into a comfortable routine. The mess halls served up the usual fare, and soldiers gathered to swap stories, share laughs, and perhaps write letters to loved ones back home. The night sky over Pearl Harbor was a blanket of stars, each one a distant, silent witness to the unfolding drama. The waters of the harbor were calm, reflecting the moonlight like a silver mirror. It was hard to imagine that this tranquil scene would soon be shattered by the chaos of war. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The calm before the storm, the quiet before the crescendo. Little did you know, as you lay down to rest that night, that in a few short hours, Pearl Harbor would transform from a sleepy military outpost into the epicenter of a global conflict. The events of December 7, 1941, would forever alter the course of history, and you, a small yet integral part of this grand narrative, were about to be swept into its whirlwind. But for now, sleep came easily, and the world held its breath, waiting for the dawn. And so, as you drifted off to sleep on that starry night, unbeknownst to you, an armada of 353 Japanese aircraft, like a sinister swarm of bees, was already on its way. The clock ticked towards 6 a.m. on December 7, 1941, and the first wave of planes was just over the horizon, ready to unleash chaos upon your tranquil slice of paradise. The commander of this operation, Mitsuo Fuchida, was about to etch his name into the annals of history, or infamy, depending on which side of the Pacific you're on. At 6:10 a.m., the first wave approached Oahu, led by Fuchida himself. This wasn't a leisurely Sunday morning flyover, mind you. This was a meticulously choreographed assault with a singular objective: cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet. As the planes zeroed in on their targets, you might have been jolted awake by the distant rumble of engines, a sound that would soon crescendo into a full-blown symphony of destruction. By 7:55 a.m., the first bombs fell, and boy, did all hell break loose. The USS Arizona, a battleship that was the pride of the fleet, found itself directly in the crosshairs. At 8:10 a.m., a 760-pound armor-piercing bomb slammed into its forward magazine, turning the ship into a fiery inferno. In less than 9 minutes, she sank, taking with her 177 crew members, a staggering loss that made the Arizona the tombstone of Pearl Harbor. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Your role in this grand narrative was about to unfold with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. As sirens wailed and chaos erupted, soldiers like you scrambled from your bunks, likely in various states of bewilderment and undress. Grab your gear, grab your wits. Both were in short supply that morning. Confusion reigned supreme. Orders were barked, often drowned out by the cacophony of explosions and gunfire. This was trial by fire, quite literally. The USS Nevada, moored ahead of the Arizona, managed to get underway, despite being hit multiple times. It was an act of sheer audacity, as the ship attempted to make a break for the open sea. But like a moth to a flame, it drew the attackers' attention. Bombs rained down, forcing the Nevada to beach itself to avoid sinking and blocking the harbor entrance. The chaos was palpable, a swirling vortex of smoke, fire, and debris. Now let's talk heroics, because in the midst of this calamity, there were moments of extraordinary bravery. Take Messman Third Class Doris Dory Miller, for example. Miller, a cook on the USS West Virginia, found himself thrust into the spotlight. When the attack began, he sprang into action, manning an anti-aircraft gun, despite having no formal training on the weapon. His actions that morning would earn him the Navy Cross, making him one of the first African-American heroes of World War II. And then there was Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, who, while orchestrating this aerial onslaught, reportedly radioed back to his superiors the infamous phrase, Tora, Tora, Tora. A coded message indicating complete surprise had been achieved. It's a phrase that would later be immortalized in film, capturing the audacity of the attack. But before you start thinking this was some kind of cinematic spectacle, remember the harsh reality. Over 400 Americans died that day, with another 178 wounded. The attack left the Pacific Fleet in tatters, with 8 battleships damaged or sunk, alongside cruisers, destroyers, and nearly 200 aircraft destroyed on the ground. This wasn't just a military strike. It was a gut punch to American morale. As the morning turned to afternoon, the attack subsided, leaving behind a scene of devastation and disbelief. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burning oil and gunpowder. Soldiers, sailors, and civilians alike were left to grapple with the aftermath, a task as Herculean as it was heart-wrenching. In the days to come, the United States would rally, fueled by a collective fury and resolve. On December 7, 1941, as the sun set over the smoldering wreckage of Pearl Harbor, the world had irrevocably changed. You, a soldier amid the chaos, were now part of a larger story, one of resilience, retribution, and redemption. Yet, let's not wrap this up with a neat little bow. In the coming days, the political and social landscape would shift dramatically. as the U.S. was catapulted into the global conflict of World War II. So, while the attack itself might have ended, the repercussions were just beginning to ripple across the world. Keep your boots laced and your helmet close, because the whirlwind of history is far from over. Stay tuned for the next chapter, where the response to this infamous day unfolds with all the drama and determination you'd expect from a nation scorned. As the dust settled over the wreckage of Pearl Harbor, the United States stood at a crossroads, teetering between disbelief and grim determination. You, along with thousands of others, sifted through the aftermath, a somber inventory of destruction that was as daunting as it was personal. Let's talk numbers, shall we? Over 400 Americans lost their lives, a staggering toll that included 68 civilians. The USS Arizona's fiery demise claimed nearly half of those military casualties. Then there was the material loss. 8 battleships, including the Arizona, lay in ruins. 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and almost 200 aircraft were either damaged or obliterated. This wasn't just a setback. It was an outright catastrophe. But hey, America wasn't about to throw in the towel. Enter President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who, on December 8, 1941, delivered what would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. His Day of Infamy address was a masterclass in rhetoric, rallying a nation in shock and despair. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, he declared, his voice resonating with a blend of steely resolve and controlled fury. By the end of his address, Congress had declared war on Japan. Only one representative, Jeanette Rankin, had the audacity to vote against it, sticking to her pacifist guns in a room filled with the fervor of retribution. But let's dig deeper into the military response, because this wasn't just about words. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, battered but not broken, began a frantic scramble to salvage and repair what they could. Shipyard workers, engineers, and sailors worked around the clock, turning the naval base into a hive of Herculean effort. Within months, several of those damaged ships were back in action, a testament to American tenacity and industrial might. The USS Nevada, for instance, shrugged off the damage like a prizefighter, spitting out a tooth, and was back in service by December 1942. Now, about those intelligence failures. The messy business of hindsight. Speculation and conspiracy theories have swirled around Pearl Harbor like flies at a summer barbecue. How did this happen? Was it an oversight, negligence, or something more sinister? Theories range from the plausible to the downright ludicrous. Some claim FDR knew of the attack in advance and allowed it to happen to galvanize the nation into war, an idea as popular in conspiracy circles as tin foil hats. The reality, however, was less a grand conspiracy and more a tragic comedy of errors. Intelligence was scattered, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle tossed into the wind. Despite intercepting Japanese communications, the U.S. failed to piece together the clues. Bureaucratic bungling and interdepartmental rivalries meant that crucial information was either misinterpreted or stuck in the mud of military procedure. The U.S. underestimated Japan's capabilities, assuming any attack would occur in the Philippines or Southeast Asia, not right on their Hawaiian doorstep. Yet, for all the intelligence blunders, the attack on Pearl Harbor was a tactical triumph for Japan, but a strategic miscalculation. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, famously lamented, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." And boy, was he right. America's military-industrial complex cranked into high gear, producing planes, tanks, and ships like a well-oiled machine, ready to wage a war on a scale previously unimaginable. The political ramifications were seismic. Isolationism, once a popular stance, was now as appealing as a soggy sandwich. The United States, once hesitant to get involved in foreign conflicts, now found itself leading the charge. The attack united a fractured nation, transforming public opinion virtually overnight. The Axis powers had unwittingly galvanized a superpower, setting the stage for a global showdown that would redefine the 20th century. Yet, amidst this whirlwind of change, the human stories of Pearl Harbor shine through like beacons. Ordinary men and women, thrust into extraordinary circumstances, rose to the occasion. There were acts of heroism that defied the chaos. Sailors risking their lives to pull comrades from burning ships, civilians organizing makeshift hospitals, and communities rallying around their service members. These stories remind us that history is not just a series of events, but a tapestry woven from countless individual threads. As you process the enormity of that fateful day, the world around you shifted on its axis. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not just a military strike. It was a catalyst for transformation. It shattered the illusion of American invulnerability, igniting a firestorm of retaliation and resilience. The stage was set for a conflict that would stretch across continents and oceans, an epic struggle between tyranny and freedom. So, as the sun set on December 8, 1941, and the echoes of FDR's speech reverberated across the nation, you were part of a story still unfolding. The attack's aftermath rippled through every facet of American life, from military strategy to domestic policy, reshaping the nation's identity and purpose. And while the path ahead was fraught with challenges, one thing was clear. The United States would not back down. The sleeping giant was wide awake, and history would never be the same. Stick around, because the story's far from over. Ahead lies the tale of a nation gearing up for war, the home front mobilizing with unprecedented fervor, and the world bracing for the epic battles to come. Keep your eyes peeled, your ears open, and your spirit unyielding, for the saga of World War Roman II is just beginning, and you're right in the thick of it. Stay tuned for the next chapter, where the drama only intensifies, and the stakes continue to climb. And so, with the echoes of infamy still ringing in your ears, the United States stood poised at the precipice of global conflict, a transformation as inevitable as it was profound. The attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't just a wake-up call. It was a blaring alarm that shattered the isolationist dreams of a nation and thrust Americans into the harsh light of wartime reality. Imagine it. Overnight, the U.S. went from spectator to headliner in the greatest showdown of the 20th century. You see, Pearl Harbor was more than a military catastrophe. It was a catalyst for change. As the dust settled, Americans, previously as divided as a Thanksgiving dinner table with politics on the menu, found themselves united by a singular resolve: to wage war. And this wasn't just any war. It was a global brawl that demanded everything from everyone. From the factory floors to the battlefronts, the U.S. mobilized like a giant stretching after a long nap, ready to shake off the cobwebs of complacency. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of this grand mobilization. The impact on American society was as profound as a plot twist in a binge-worthy series. The draft was expanded, swelling the ranks of the military to unfathomable numbers. By war's end, over 16 million Americans had donned the uniform, a staggering 12% of the population. Imagine that, a nation of civilians transformed into soldiers, sailors, and airmen, ready to take on the Axis powers. But a war isn't fought on guts and glory alone. It's also about logistics, those thrilling details that make or break a campaign. The U.S. cranked up its industrial machine, and oh boy, did it deliver. Factories that once churned out cars and consumer goods pivoted to producing tanks, planes, and ships at a breakneck pace. By 1944, American factories were rolling out one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Talk about efficiency. Industry titans like Ford and General Motors swapped assembly lines for production lines, cranking out the tools of war with a fervor that would make even Henry Ford's ghost nod in approval. And what about the home front? Well, it was a whirlwind of change, as American society retooled itself to support the war effort. Women, who had been largely relegated to domestic roles, now found themselves at the forefront of the workforce. Rosie, the riveter, became an icon, a symbol of female empowerment and grit. By 1945, women made up nearly 37% of the civilian workforce, a seismic shift that would ripple through the decades. But let's not sugarcoat it. This transformation wasn't all sunshine and unity. The war effort demanded sacrifices as monumental as the cause itself. Rationing became a way of life, with everything from gasoline to butter rationed to ensure the troops had what they needed. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards, a testament to the American spirit of self-reliance and thrift. Families huddled around radios, listening to news from the front lines, their hearts divided between pride and worry. Economically, the war was both a burden and a boon. The U.S. government, which had been penny-pinching like a miser in a Dickens novel, suddenly found itself spending like a sailor on shore leave. The national debt skyrocketed from $49 billion in 1941 to a staggering $259 billion by 1945. But it was a gamble that paid off, as wartime production pulled the nation out of the Great Depression, creating jobs and prosperity in its wake. And let's talk strategy, because this wasn't just a scrap in a back alley. It was a chess match on a global scale. The U.S. military underwent a transformation as radical as a caterpillar morphing into a butterfly. The focus shifted from battleship fleets to aircraft carriers, those floating fortresses that would dominate the Pacific theater. The Doolittle raid in April 1942, a daring bombing run on Tokyo, was a bold statement that America was in it to win it, and it signaled a shift to offensive operations that would define the rest of the war. Of course, not all changes were strategic or economic. Pearl Harbor catalyzed a shift in public opinion that was as dramatic as a plot twist in a soap opera. Isolationism, once as American as apple pie, was now about as popular as a lead balloon. The attack had struck a chord, uniting the nation in a way that few events have before or since. The American public, galvanized by a sense of righteous indignation, was ready to do whatever it took to ensure victory. So, as the U.S. geared up for war, the world watched with bated breath. The sleeping giant was not just awake, it was wide-eyed and ready for action. The Allies had gained a formidable partner, one with resources and resolve that would tip the scales in their favor. The Axis powers, on the other hand, had poked the bear, and now they were about to face the consequences. You, dear listener, are part of this grand narrative, witnessing a nation transformed by tragedy into a force for freedom. The story of America's entry into World War II is one of resilience, innovation, and determination. It's a testament to the power of unity in the face of adversity, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, humanity can rise to the occasion. But don't get too comfortable. This saga is far from over. The battle lines are drawn, the pieces are in place, and the drama is only beginning to unfold. Keep your eyes peeled and your ears open, because the next chapter promises to be as riveting as the last. We're just getting started on this historical roller coaster, and there's no turning back now. Stay tuned, because the world of 1942 is about to erupt in a way that will change the course of history forever. As 1942 rolled in, the world was a stage set for the grand theater of conflict, and the United States had taken its place front and center. But let's rewind the reel and zoom in on Pearl Harbor's role in this drama of global proportions. You see, Pearl Harbor wasn't just a scene stealer in the narrative of World War II. It was the catalyst that rewrote the script altogether. Its impact resonated far beyond the immediate devastation, setting the stage for a new chapter in world history. First, let's talk U.S. Japan relations. Post-Pearl Harbor, these two nations were locked in a deadly pas de deux, a dance of destruction that spanned the Pacific. But fast forward to today, and you'll find the U.S. and Japan as close allies. How did we go from zero to hero in diplomatic terms? Well, it's a tale of reconciliation as profound as any Shakespearean plot twist. After the war, Japan underwent a transformation, shedding its militaristic skin for a democratic rebirth under U.S. guidance. The 1951 Treaty of San Francisco officially ended the state of war, and by 1960, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty had cemented a partnership that was as unlikely as it was enduring. Today, Japan is America's fourth largest trading partner, with bilateral trade amounting to a cool $218 billion in 2022. But let's not sugarcoat it. Road to reconciliation was as bumpy as a jeep ride over a minefield. The scars of war ran deep, and rebuilding trust took decades of diplomacy, cultural exchange, and mutual understanding. It was a process of healing that involved acknowledging the past, from the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to Japan's own wartime atrocities. Yet, the result is a relationship that stands as a testament to the power of forgiveness and the potential for growth beyond conflict. Now, when it comes to memorializing Pearl Harbor, the site itself has become a powerful symbol of both loss and resilience. Each year, over 1.8 million visitors make the pilgrimage to the Pearl Harbor National Memorial, standing in silent tribute to the USS Arizona Memorial, which marks the final resting place of more than 1,000 sailors. The memorial, completed in 1962, spans the sunken battleship, a poignant reminder of sacrifice and the high cost of war. But let's dive into how Pearl Harbor has been portrayed in media and pop culture, because oh boy, has Hollywood had a field day. From the 1970 film Tora, 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 which, with its meticulous attention to detail, aimed to present a balanced account of the attack to Michael Bay's 2001 blockbuster Pearl Harbor, which, let's face it, took more liberties than a kid in a candy store. The event has been dramatized, romanticized, and sometimes sensationalized. The 2001 movie, despite its historical inaccuracies, grossed a staggering $449 million worldwide, proving that while audiences love a good war story, they're often more interested in the explosions than the facts. Yet, these portrayals often gloss over the gritty reality of war. It's easy to get swept up in the romance of heroism and sacrifice, but it's crucial to remember the human cost behind the legends. Over 400 Americans perished at Pearl Harbor, each a life cut short, a family left grieving. War isn't just a backdrop for epic tales. It's a brutal, unforgiving beast that leaves devastation in its wake. The romanticism of war, perpetuated by media and sanitized narratives, often obscures the harsh truth that real people paid the ultimate price. And while we're myth-busting, let's address the notion of Pearl Harbor as a flawless sneak attack. Sure, the element of surprise was a tactical win for Japan, but the attack also galvanized the U.S. into action, awakening a sleeping giant with a resolve as unyielding as a battleship's hull. It's a stark reminder that every military action has consequences, often far beyond what its architects envision. And reflecting on Pearl Harbor's legacy, we're reminded that history isn't a static tableau of events. It's a dynamic, ever-evolving story shaped by those who lived it and those who remember it. The attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't just an entry point into World War II. It was a turning point that redefined global power dynamics, reshaping the political landscape for generations to come. So, as you tuck into bed with these thoughts swirling like the Pacific's currents, remember that the lessons of Pearl Harbor are as relevant today as they were in 1941. They remind us of the fragility of peace, the costs of complacency, and the power of resilience and reconciliation. History, after all, is not just about dates and battles. It's about the human stories that weave the fabric of our shared past. And as we look to the future, guided by the echoes of history, we carry these lessons forward, determined to forge a world where the spectre of war is but a distant memory. Sleep well, knowing that the past is not just a record of what was, but a guide to what can be. Your alarm clock is the crowing of a rooster, and there's no snooze button. Welcome to the life of a medieval farmer, where getting out of bed isn't motivated by a paycheck, but by sheer survival instincts. You're not just farming for fun, or because it's trendy to grow your own kale. No, you're farming because if you don't, you and your family might starve to death. The day kicks off with the sun peeking over the horizon, and you're already behind schedule. That's because your life is dictated by Mother Nature's clock, and she's got zero chill. You've got to be out in the fields before the dew evaporates, managing the kind of back-breaking labor that makes modern gym workouts look like a gentle stroll in the park. It's not just about planting seeds and whistling a happy tune. It's about understanding the crop cycle intimately, like know it better than you know your spouse, intimately. Let's talk specifics. If you're in the business of wheat, for example, your year revolves around a tight schedule. Winter wheat is sowed in the fall to overwinter, sprouting up in the spring, and harvested by early summer. Mess this up, and you're toast, literally, because no wheat means no bread. And if you think you can just buy your way out of a bad harvest, think again. Grain prices could fluctuate wildly, with famine years seeing prices soar higher than a medieval turret. In 1350, during the Great Famine, grain prices tripled. You can't just swipe your medieval credit card or hit up the local farmer's market. You're stuck. Now let's add some weather into this delightful mix. The medieval climate was about as predictable as a cat on catnip. One year, the sun's shining, the birds are singing, and your crops are flourishing. The next, you're hit with a summer so wet that your wheat turns to mush, or a drought that shrivels everything to a crisp. Remember, this is the Little Ice Age period, roughly from the 14th to the 19th century, where the global temperatures took a nosedive. Frosts in July, totally a thing. And while you're wrestling with the whims of weather, there's the soil to consider. Fertilizer isn't coming in neat bags from the garden centre. It's whatever manure you can scrape together. You might have a 3-field rotation system going, 1 field for winter crops, 1 for summer, and 1 lying fallow to recover. But it's a constant juggle with the scant resources at your disposal. Don't forget the tools of the trade. You're looking at a simple plough, maybe with an ox or 2 if you're lucky, and slightly more affluent. Otherwise, it's the old-fashioned way, hand tools and pure muscle power. The plough's design hasn't changed much since Roman times, and it's as ergonomic as a medieval torture device. Every furrow you turn is a reminder that your chiropractor is centuries away from being invented. Then there's the social and economic tapestry you're woven into. Most likely, you're a serf, which means you don't even own the land you're breaking your back over. You're tied to it, owing labor and a portion of your yield to the lord of the manor. Think of it as the world's worst job contract, with no benefits and no escape clause. Even if you're a free peasant, you're still subject to the whims of local lords and the unpredictable demands of the feudal economy. Taxes are paid in kind, which means if the harvest fails, you might still have to cough up a share of what you don't have. Life's a game of survival, and the margin for error is razor thin. A single bad harvest can spiral into disaster, setting off a chain reaction of food shortages, malnutrition, and disease. In 1360, after the infamous Great Famine, records show that entire villages were abandoned, the population declining because people either starved outright or fled in search of food. Sure, the romantic image of the noble peasant living in harmony with the earth persists in modern minds. But the reality, it's a grueling treadmill of toil and stress, with nature, economics, and politics all conspiring against you. It's a miracle anyone survived at all, let alone thrived. But hey, at least you're getting plenty of fresh air, right? Well, let's dive deeper into those breezy fiscal winds that would make even the toughest medieval farmer wish for a bailout. Welcome to the economic reality of medieval farming, where the only thing more certain than death and taxes was that both would come knocking sooner than you'd like. You see, if you're a farmer in the Middle Ages, you're not just growing crops for your own dinner table. Nope, you're working for a whole slew of other folks who seem to have developed a taste for living off your labor. Let's break this down. First up, we have taxes. And unlike today, where you might begrudgingly file online and wait for a refund, medieval taxes were a whole different beast. The king, the church, and your local lord all had their hands in your pockets, metaphorically speaking. And since you're not dealing in cash, but in crops, livestock, and labor, these taxes were paid with the sweat of your brow and the fruits of your fields. Take the tithe, for instance. This charming little 10% cut of your produce went straight to the church. And we're not talking just your local parish priest, who might be sympathetic to your struggles. No, this was a well-oiled machine that funneled resources up the ecclesiastical chain. And before you start thinking, 10% doesn't sound too bad, remember this is a slice of your total haul, good year or bad. Imagine coughing up 1/10 of your meager harvest during a famine year. Not so heavenly now, is it? But wait, there's more. Let's talk about the manorial dues. Under the manorial system, your local lord owned the land you worked, and you were stuck in a feudal arrangement that made modern landlord-tenant relationships look like a utopian dream. You, as a serf, were bound to this estate, providing labor, produce, and sometimes even money if you managed to scrape together a few coins. In return, you got protection and the right to work the land, though protection often meant little more than a promise that your lord wouldn't pillage you himself. And here's the kicker. Those manorial dues weren't fixed. They could change based on the whims of your lord or the needs of the manor. If the lord needed funds for a new castle wing or a military campaign, guess who was footing the bill? Spoiler, it wasn't the lord. These dues could take the form of corvée labor, where you had to work the lord's land for free a certain number of days a week, leaving you less time to tend to your own crops. So, what happens when you have a year of good harvest? Are you rolling in the dough, finally? Not quite. Even a bumper crop didn't secure your financial future. First, a good year often meant more was expected of you in taxes and dues. Think of it as a medieval version of the success tax, where doing well just meant you had more to give away. Second, the market wasn't always on your side. A surplus could depress prices, meaning your hard-earned abundance fetched less at the market. Supply and demand, even back then, could be a cruel mistress. Let's not forget about the rents. If you were lucky enough not to be a serf but a tenant farmer, you paid rent to the lord. This rent was often due in the same goods you were already paying taxes with, essentially leaving you with a balancing act that would make a tightrope walker sweat. Even worse, some rents were fixed, meaning in a bad year, you might be forking over more than half of what you produced, leaving your family to subsist on the scraps. And just to put the cherry on top of this medieval cake of stress, natural disasters and political upheavals could throw the whole system into chaos. Wars meant increased taxes to fund them. A local skirmish could destroy your fields. And if the king decided to raise funds for a crusade, guess who was getting squeezed? You, that's who. In this harsh world, the romanticized view of pastoral life was about as accurate as a medieval map. Sure, the idea of living in harmony with nature sounds lovely, but in reality, you were more likely to be at war with it, and with the economic system that kept you tethered to the land. The pastoral dream was a myth that ignored the day-to-day grind and the relentless pressures that came with it. So, as you trudged home at the end of another exhausting day, the thought of a bumper crop next year wasn't a beacon of hope, but a potential liability. You constantly navigated a landscape filled with economic landmines, where every twist of fate demanded a toll. And as you lay down on your straw mattress, you might have wondered how long you could keep all these plates spinning before it all came crashing down. Stay tuned, because there's more to this story. The medieval world was a complex web of social and economic entanglements, and in the next part, we'll unravel even more of what it meant to survive, and sometimes thrive, amidst these challenges. As we wade further into the muck of medieval life, it's time to unravel the social web that ensnared a farmer tighter than a rabbit in a snare. If you thought the weather and economic pressures were daunting, wait until you get a load of the power dynamics. Spoiler alert. The farmer's life was like a game of chess where you're perpetually the pawn, and everyone else is trying to checkmate you into oblivion. Let's set the stage. Picture a world where the nobility and the church are the ultimate power couple, and you're not even invited to the wedding. The nobility owned the land, and much like a landlord with a penchant for medieval heirlooms, they leased it out to you in the form of feudal contracts. Your side of the bargain. Endless toil and a portion of your produce, naturally. If the lord was feeling particularly magnanimous, maybe he wouldn't raise your dues arbitrarily. But don't count on it. Now, about that church. Its influence was woven into the very fabric of society, from cradle to grave, baptisms to burials. The church wasn't just the spiritual compass. It was a political heavyweight that threw its ecclesiastical weight around like a sumo wrestler in a marsh pit. The tithe you paid wasn't just pocket change. It was a cut of your lifeline. And while the church preached charity, the reality was often more about hierarchy. The clergy could own land, amass wealth, and even exert control over local politics. Some priests were more CEO than shepherd, managing church estates and collecting tithes with a zeal that would put modern tax collectors to shame. Feudal obligations were like a medieval version of fine print, only with fewer loopholes and more back-breaking labor. As a serf, you were tied to the land, literally. You couldn't leave without the lord's permission, and social mobility was about as likely as finding a snowball in a blacksmith's forge. Your best bet for upward movement. Maybe, just maybe, if you were particularly pious or persuasive, you could send a son into the priesthood. But even that was a long shot, given the church's selective gatekeeping. Local politics might seem like small potatoes compared to the grand machinations of kings and popes, but in the life of a farmer, they were everything. Your village was your universe, and the manor court was like the local government, judiciary, and neighborhood watch rolled into one. Disputes over land and labor were settled here, often not in your favor if the lord had a vested interest. Villages weren't democracies. They were microcosms of the feudal system, where power flowed from the lord like water from a medieval aqueduct, often bypassing the peasants entirely. And while we're debunking myths, let's tackle the idea of the benevolent lord. Sure, some lords might have been more lenient, perhaps letting you collect firewood from the forest or graze your livestock on the common land. But benevolence was often a facade, a tool to maintain loyalty and prevent rebellion. The truth was, a lord's priority was the prosperity of his estate, not the welfare of his peasants. If that meant squeezing a little extra out of your already meager existence, so be it. The interplay between the church and nobility wasn't just about power, it was about control. The church reinforced the social order, preaching that everyone had a God-given place, and that place for you was bent over in the fields. The nobility, in turn, often funded church endeavors, which helped maintain a status quo that kept them at the top and you at the bottom. This symbiotic relationship ensured that any thoughts of rebellion were nipped in the bud, often with the threat of eternal damnation thrown in for good measure. In this world, your life wasn't dictated by what you wanted to be when you grew up, but by the land you were born on and the whims of those who controlled it. You were a cog in a vast machine, and the idea of striking out on your own was as fanciful as owning a unicorn. Your reality was one of survival, where every sunrise brought with it the challenge of making it to the next. But don't despair just yet. Amidst these seemingly insurmountable odds, there were moments of resilience and community. The village, for all its rigid hierarchies, was also a network of support. Festivals, feasts, and fairs offered rare opportunities for respite and socializing, a brief escape from the grindstone. Though the system was stacked against them, medieval farmers developed a kind of grit and ingenuity that was nothing short of remarkable. They adapted to the whims of the powerful, found ways to make do, and sometimes, just sometimes, managed to carve out a slice of happiness in a world that seemed intent on denying it. As we look ahead, remember that the story of the medieval farmer is far from over. The social structure, with its castles in the sky and serfs on the ground, sets the stage for revolutions and reforms that would one day shake the very foundations of feudal Europe. So, stay tuned as we continue this journey through the annals of history, peeling back the layers of myth to uncover the raw, unvarnished truth of life in the Middle Ages. So here we are, diving further into the murky waters of medieval farming myths. You've probably seen those dreamy depictions of quaint villages nestled in rolling hills, farmers whistling while they work, and everyone living in perfect harmony with nature. It's like a Thomas Kincaid painting, but with more dirt and fewer twinkling lights. The truth, well, let's just say reality, doesn't exactly line up with this picturesque view. Let's start by addressing the myth of the noble peasant, a character who supposedly lived a life of virtuous simplicity, content with their lot in life. It's a cozy narrative, right? The humble farmer, tilling the land with a smile, pausing only to wipe their brow and revel in the satisfaction of honest work. But if you think that's accurate, I've got a bridge from the Middle Ages to sell you. In reality, the medieval peasant's life was more akin to a grueling episode of Survivor than a pastoral idyll. How do we know? Well, medieval chroniclers like John of Salisbury and Jean Froissart didn't mince words when describing the relentless drudgery these farmers faced daily. And speaking of drudgery, let's talk about the tools of the trade. A farmer's best friend was the humble plough, which, despite being high-tech for its time, was about as easy to use as a smartphone with a rotary dial. No wonder back pain was practically an occupational hazard. And about that simple life myth, sure, it sounds appealing, like stepping away from the hustle and bustle of modern life. But simplicity in the Middle Ages meant something entirely different. We're talking about a life stripped down to the bare essentials. No running water, no electricity, and definitely no Amazon Prime. If you wanted something, you either made it yourself or traded for it, assuming you had anything to trade after paying taxes and dues. Then there's the notion of community support, often depicted as a medieval version of a block party, where everyone pitches in and helps each other out. It's a nice idea, and to some extent, it's true. Villages were tight-knit, and cooperation was necessary for survival. But this wasn't some utopian commune. Social tensions simmered under the surface, and disputes over resources could turn neighbors into adversaries faster than you can say feudal contract. Now, let's pivot to those pastoral scenes immortalized in art and literature. You know the ones. Lush green fields stretching to the horizon, shepherds tending to flocks under a serene sky. These images, like those found in the Tres Riches Hura's Du Duc de Berry, a 15th century manuscript, are more about projecting an ideal than reflecting the grimy truth. These scenes were commissioned by the wealthy to showcase a serene, ordered world, the kind of world they wanted to believe in, not the one that actually existed. In reality, the average medieval landscape was a patchwork of cultivated fields, fallow land, and wilderness. The fields themselves were like a living jigsaw puzzle, divided into strips that each farmer worked. It wasn't uncommon for a peasant to have scattered plots, which meant more time walking from field to field than actually farming. And let's not forget the animals. They didn't roam idyllic pastures all day. They were often brought into homes at night for safety, making your living quarters smell more barnyard chic than cozy cottage. But why does this romanticized vision persist? It's partly nostalgia, a longing for a time when life supposedly made more sense. And let's face it, the idea of a farmer working in harmony with the earth is infinitely more appealing than the grind of modern life. Yet, this nostalgia often glosses over the harsh realities. For instance, medieval farming wasn't just about food production. It was a constant battle against starvation. Bad harvests, pests, and disease could wipe out a year's work, leaving villages on the brink of famine. Consider the 14th century, a period marked by the Little Ice Age, where colder temperatures and erratic weather patterns threw farming into chaos. Accounts from the time, like those of the chronicler Matthew Paris, detail how these conditions led to crop failures and widespread hunger. In fact, the Great Famine of 1315-1317 was so severe that it's estimated to have reduced the population of Northern Europe by 10% to 25%. And speaking of famines, let's debunk another myth, the idea that medieval farmers had access to a wide variety of foods. True, they ate more grains and vegetables than we might think, but their diet was far from diverse. Bread was the staple, often paired with pottage, kind of grain and vegetable stew. Meat was a luxury, reserved for special occasions or the tables of the wealthy. And forget about spices or sugars. Those were the domain of the elite, the medieval equivalent of caviar and champagne. Even when times were good, the work was never-ending. Fields needed ploughing, crops required sowing, and animals needed tending. Winter might offer a slight respite, but it was also a time for repairing tools, making clothes, and preparing for the next year's cycle. It was a life of relentless toil, where the line between survival and disaster was razor-thin. So why do we cling to these myths? Partly because they offer a comforting narrative, a way to romanticize a past that was anything but romantic, but also because they remind us of our connection to the land, a connection that, despite our modern conveniences, still holds a certain allure. However, it's crucial to remember that this connection came at a steep cost for those who lived it. As we continue to peel back the layers of history, we'll see that the story of medieval farming is far from over. The myths and legends that surround it are just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath lies a complex tapestry of human struggle, resilience, and adaptation. So stick around as we delve deeper into the annals of time, uncovering more truths and debunking more myths along the way. As we continue to peel back the layers of history, we'll see that the story of medieval farming is far from over. The myths and legends that surround it are just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath lies a complex tapestry of human struggle, resilience, and adaptation. So stick around as we delve deeper into the annals of time, uncovering more truths and debunking more myths along the way. Fast forward a few centuries, and you'll find that those medieval farmers, not exactly the poster children for living your best life, actually laid the groundwork for the agricultural systems we rely on today. It's like finding out your crusty old great-grandpa was secretly a foundational genius, setting up trust funds while you thought he was just muttering to himself in the corner. First off, let's talk crop rotation. This wasn't just a clever way to avoid soil exhaustion. It was the medieval farmer's equivalent of a life hack. By rotating wheat, barley, and letting fields go fallow, they inadvertently set the stage for modern sustainable farming practices. Today, crop rotation helps control pests, improve soil structure, and boost productivity. It's the gift that keeps on giving, like a medieval version of a subscription box, minus the monthly fees, and those simple plows. They evolved over time into the sophisticated machinery that fuels contemporary agriculture. Back in the day, the plow was like a medieval sports car, if your sports car got stuck in the mud and had to be pulled by oxen. Innovations eventually led to lighter, more efficient designs, paving the way for the mechanized behemoths we see today. It's a classic case of standing on the shoulders of giants, even if those giants were knee-deep in mud. Now, brace yourself for a shocker. The concept of land ownership and leasing from those feudal contracts has echoes in modern property law. Sure, It's not the same as owing your firstborn to the lord of the manor, but the idea of leasing land, paying rent, and the rights of tenants are still part of the legal landscape. It's a testament to how deeply those medieval roots run, whether we like it or not. So, what about the legacy of resilience? Let's give a nod to the grit and determination of these farmers, who, despite plagues, famines, and the occasional marauding neighbor, managed to keep communities fed and functioning. It's like they were the original survivalists, minus the reality TV deals. This resilience is celebrated in today's agricultural communities, where the spirit of adaptation and perseverance continues to thrive. Farmers are still at the mercy of unpredictable weather, fluctuating markets, and political whims, but they persist, drawing on a legacy that's centuries in the making. Yet, the story of medieval farming isn't just about enduring hardship. It's also about the social bonds that were forged in the crucible of necessity. The communal effort required to bring in a harvest, the shared celebrations when the work was done. These aspects of rural life created a sense of belonging and mutual support that transcends time. Today, we see echoes of this in community-supported agriculture, farmers' markets, and the local food movement. These modern initiatives are like a nod to our ancestors, a recognition of the interconnectedness that sustained them. But let's not get too misty-eyed about it. The romanticized image of the noble peasant, content with their lot, is still mostly baloney. The reality was harsh, the work backbreaking, and the rewards often scant. However, acknowledging the hardships doesn't diminish their accomplishments, it highlights them. The fact that they managed to lay the groundwork for future generations, despite the odds, is nothing short of remarkable. So, the next time you bite into a sandwich, consider the medieval farmer who toiled in fields and paid tithes to both church and state, and whose legacy, against all odds, managed to plant the seeds of modern agriculture. Their story is a reminder that history is full of unsung heroes, often muddied and overlooked, but essential to the tapestry of human progress. As we wrap up this journey through time, consider this. The medieval farmer's life was a delicate dance with nature and society, a testament to human tenacity. Their resilience is woven into the very fabric of our world today. While we may no longer live in thatched cottages or plough fields with oxen, the echoes of their struggles and triumphs resonate in our fields, our laws, and even in our DNA. It's a legacy that challenges us to appreciate where we come from, and perhaps to lend a little more respect to those who cultivate our future. Winston Churchill's early life reads like a coming-of-age story with a penchant for drama and a dash of absurdity. Born in 1874 in the grand Blenheim Palace, young Winston was thrust into a world where expectations were as high as the ceilings of his ancestral home. You'd think being the grandson of the 7th Duke of Marlborough would guarantee a smooth path, but Churchill's journey was anything but a stroll through the English countryside. As a child, Churchill was as rebellious as a Victorian schoolboy could get. He bounced from school to school like a rock star on tour, racking up detentions and bad grades with the kind of aplomb that foreshadowed his future flair for controversy. At Harrow School, he was the kind of student who made teachers question their career choices. He once famously quipped, "I was on the whole considerably discouraged by my school days. It was not pleasant to feel oneself so completely outclassed and left behind at the beginning of the race." But if Churchill was lagging in Latin and Greek, he was already excelling in resilience and a knack for making an impression. Moving on to Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy, Churchill finally found his groove. Despite failing the entrance exam twice, he made it on his 3rd attempt, which seems fitting for a man whose tenacity would become legendary. By 1895, Churchill was a cavalry officer, and soon his exploits would take him far beyond the parade grounds of Sandhurst. Churchill's taste for adventure was as insatiable as his appetite for cigars and whiskey. He made his mark in the military not just with his courage, but with his pen, moonlighting as a war correspondent. In 1899, he found himself in South Africa, covering the Boer War. Now, here's where things get spicy. Captured by the Boers, who clearly didn't appreciate his prose, Churchill was tossed into a POW camp. But staying put was never his style. In a daring escape worthy of a Hollywood script, he scaled a wall, harped a train, and trekked over 300 miles to freedom with just a little bit of chocolate and dry biscuits to sustain him. When he finally crossed into Portuguese East Africa, he was hailed as a hero back home. His escape made headlines, boosting his public profile and setting the stage for his entry into politics. Churchill's early political career was a roller coaster of triumphs and gaffes. Elected to Parliament at 25, he quickly made a name for himself, though not always in the way he intended. He switched parties more often than some people change socks, starting as a Conservative, then crossing the floor to the Liberals. This wasn't just political opportunism. Churchill was a man driven by conviction, even if it meant burning bridges along the way. His early speeches were marked by a flair for the dramatic and an unshakable belief in his own abilities, even when reality suggested otherwise. His time as First Lord of the Admiralty was particularly colourful, to say the least. His ambitious plans to modernize the British Navy were as bold as they were costly, and not every idea floated. But failure didn't deter him. If anything, it fueled his determination. Churchill was a man who thrived on conflict, whether it was with political rivals or the odds themselves. His early years were a testament to his resilience, a quality that would define his leadership in the years to come. Churchill's capacity to rebound from setbacks was almost supernatural. He seemed to operate on the belief that failure was just an opportunity in disguise. While others might have been content with a quiet life of nobility, Churchill was destined for more, whether the world was ready or not. In retrospect, Churchill's early life was a tapestry of contradictions and complexities. He was a man of privilege who identified with the common man, a soldier who preferred the pen to the sword, and a politician who thrived on unpredictability. These early experiences shaped his worldview and imbued him with a gritty determination that would serve him well in the challenging years ahead. As we delve deeper into his life, it becomes clear that Churchill was more than just a historical figure. He was a force of nature, as unpredictable and relentless as the British weather. But every force of nature eventually meets resistance, and Churchill's was a storm of his own making. The early 1920s flung him into political exile faster than a Victorian matron could clutch her pearls. Let's talk about his infamous decision in 1925 to return Britain to the gold standard at pre-war exchange rates. Sounds like financial wizardry. Right. Wrong. This move was about as popular as a skunk at a garden party and had the economic impact of throwing a spanner in the works of a sputtering engine. It led to deflation, unemployment, and a wave of strikes that had the country teetering on the edge of chaos. Churchill, meanwhile, clung to his conviction like a man shipwrecked at sea, steadfastly ignoring the rising tide of criticism. But even the most stubborn politician can't ignore reality forever. By the late 1920s, his political career was starting to resemble a Shakespearean tragedy. He was booted from the Conservative government in 1929, not for the last time finding himself on the outside looking in. These were his so-called wilderness years, though calling them that is a bit romantic, like labeling your basement apartment a cozy retreat. In truth, Churchill was more of a political pariah than a roguish outsider. He was left to wander the periphery of political life, which sounds poetic until you remember that Churchill was also facing personal financial ruin. Yes, even Churchill had to pay the bills, and his lifestyle was as extravagant as his rhetoric. His penchant for Cuban cigars and fine spirits wasn't exactly covered by a modest income. By the early 1930s, he was bleeding money faster than a sieve holds water. So, how did he cope? By picking up the pen, of course. Writing became his lifeline. He churned out articles and books with the enthusiasm of an author trying to meet a deadline, and let's not forget his prodigious history of the First World War, which, while not an instant bestseller, helped stave off the debt collectors for a little while. But life wasn't all about words and whiskey. Churchill's battles with what he called the Black Dog, his term for depression, were as fierce as any political struggle. And yet, even in his darkest hours, he retained a Churchillian flair for the dramatic. It's said that he often dressed in his finest attire, even when there was no audience to impress. Depression was a formidable opponent, but Churchill tackled it with as much bravado as he did any political foe. Now, let's tackle a myth that has the staying power of a cockroach in a nuclear apocalypse. The idea that Churchill was a lone prophet, foreseeing the rise of Nazi Germany while others slumbered in ignorance. It's true that Churchill was an early and vocal critic of Hitler's regime. His speeches in the 1930 warning of Germany's rearmament were as fiery as a July bonfire, but the notion that he was the only one with a crystal ball is a bit of a stretch. Others, too, saw the storm clouds gathering over Europe, but Churchill's talent lay in his ability to articulate the threat with a clarity that others lacked, or feared to express. The reality was far more complex. Many in Britain were still reeling from the First World War, and the thought of another conflict was about as appealing as a root canal. Appeasement was the order of the day, and Churchill's warnings were often dismissed as the ravings of a man out of touch with reality. This wasn't a case of Churchill being the sole voice of reason. It was more about timing and the political climate. His words were prescient, sure, but they were also inconvenient for a government eager to avoid another war. Churchill's wilderness years were a cocktail of brilliance and banishment, resilience and rejection. He was a man out of step with the times, but utterly convinced he was marching to a better tune. It's easy to romanticize this period as the crucible that forged the leader who would eventually steer Britain through its darkest hours. Yet, the reality is that Churchill's exile was as much about his own missteps as it was about political blindness. The man who would become the symbol of defiance was, for a time, the very picture of isolation. As we leave this chapter of Churchill's life, the stage is set for a comeback of epic proportions. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, we're left with a man on the fringes of power, grappling with personal demons and financial woes, yet somehow managing to keep his name in the headlines. Churchill's story is far from over, and the next act promises to be as unpredictable as the man himself. Stay tuned, because the roller coaster of Winston Churchill's life is just about to hit another exhilarating loop. So, here we are, on the brink of Churchill's grand re-entry into the political arena, where the stakes are higher than a cat on a hot tin roof. It's the late 1930s, and if Britain's political scene was a game of musical chairs, Churchill was the guy who'd been left standing one too many times. Yet, just like a classic underdog story, the tides were turning in his favor, and not a moment too soon, as Europe teetered on the edge of chaos. With Hitler strutting around Europe like he owned the place, Britain's initial strategy seemed to involve sticking their heads in the sand while humming Cumbria. The policy of appeasement, championed by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, was about as effective as using a sieve to bail out a sinking ship. Chamberlain's infamous 1938 Declaration of Peace for Our Time was the political equivalent of declaring victory, because the volcano hasn't erupted yet. Meanwhile, Churchill was back in Parliament, throwing verbal tomatoes at the government, warning anyone who'd listen, and plenty who wouldn't, of the growing Nazi threat. Churchill's speeches during this period were like a caffeine jolt to a sleep-deprived nation. His knack for oratory was legendary, with phrases that could make even the most cynical Brits sit up and take notice. Take his 1938 critique of the Munich Agreement, where he lamented, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war." It was the kind of prophetic burn that would make Nostradamus nod in approval. By 1940, the inevitable had happened. Germany invaded Poland, and Britain found itself dragged into yet another world war. Chamberlain's political currency evaporated faster than morning dew, paving the way for Churchill's return to power. On May 10, 1940, Churchill became Prime Minister, a role he seemed born to play, despite the fact that he just inherited a job nobody in their right mind would want, a nation on the brink of collapse and an enemy knocking at the door. Leading Britain through World War II was no cakewalk, but Churchill tackled it with a blend of determination and eccentricity that was pure vintage Winston. He was a man of contradictions, puffing cigars like a chimney while drafting plans to save the free world. His work habits were, shall we say, unconventional. Picture this: Churchill dictating memos from his bathtub, cigar in one hand, whiskey in the other, because why not conduct state business while soaking in suds? It said he spent more time in his dressing gown than most people do in their evening wear, embodying a kind of aristocratic casual that made business casual look uptight. Churchill's leadership during the Blitz was marked by his ability to rally the British public with speeches as rousing as a halftime pep talk to a losing team. His words were a balm for a nation under siege, offering both a stiff upper lip and a shot of adrenaline. His "We Shall Fight on the Beaches" speech in June 1940 is a classic, with lines that could make even the most jaded listener feel like grabbing a pitchfork and heading to the nearest beach. But behind the rhetoric was a very real understanding of Britain's dire situation, one where every decision could mean the difference between survival and defeat. Strategically, Churchill's decisions were a mix of brilliance and gamble. He understood the importance of allies and worked tirelessly to secure American support, charming President Franklin D. Roosevelt with his bulldog tenacity and a shared love of naval history. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941, which provided the UK with desperately needed military supplies, was a lifeline as vital as oxygen, worth about $31 billion by war's end, a staggering figure that makes modern aid packages look like pocket change. Yet, it's important to debunk the myth of Churchill as an infallible wartime leader. His military strategies weren't always golden. The 1940 Norway campaign, for instance, was a debacle that had more in common with a slapstick comedy than a military operation. Despite these setbacks, Churchill's sheer force of personality kept him at the helm. His leadership style was less about calculated strategy and more about inspiring a nation to dig deep and keep fighting, like a captain rallying his crew in the face of a storm. Churchill's quirks were as much a part of his legend as his speeches. His fondness for champagne was legendary. He reportedly drank over 42,000 bottles of Paul Roger in his lifetime, a number so high it could have single-handedly kept the French champagne industry afloat through sheer consumption. And let's not forget his penchant for naps, which he credited with giving him the stamina to work late into the night. His daily schedule could make a night owl look like an early bird, with work sessions often stretching into the wee hours. Despite the larger-than-life aura, Churchill was not without his critics. His bulldog approach sometimes bordered on stubbornness, and he could be as hard to steer as an ocean liner in a kiddie pool. His decision to bomb German cities, including the controversial firebombing of Dresden in 1945, remains a topic of heated debate, with some historians questioning the morality and necessity of such actions. It's a stark reminder that even the most revered leaders are not immune to the murky ethics of wartime decisions. Churchill's wartime leadership is often romanticized as a tale of unyielding resolve, but the reality was far more nuanced. Behind the cigar smoke and rallying cries was a man juggling the pressures of leadership with the demons of his past. His struggle with depression, the black dog, never truly left him, and the weight of the war bore heavily on his shoulders. Yet through it all, Churchill remained the figurehead Britain needed, a symbol of resilience in a world gone mad. As we wrap up this chapter of Churchill's life, we're left with a portrait of a man who was as complex as the times he lived in. His tenure as Prime Minister during World War II was a blend of triumphs and trials, a testament to the power of words and the indomitable human spirit. But the war wasn't over yet, and Churchill's story was still unfolding, with more twists and turns than a spy thriller. Stay tuned, because the next chapter promises to be just as riveting as the last. And so, as World War II drew to a close, and the dust began to settle across a battered Europe, Winston Churchill found himself at a crossroads, the likes of which could make even the hardiest leader break out in a cold sweat. The man who had rallied a nation with speeches that could stir the soul now faced a post-war Britain that was ready to swap the drama of wartime leadership for the comforting embrace of peacetime reform. It's a bit like a rock band trying to follow up its epic world tour with a quiet acoustic album. Sometimes the crowd just wants a different tune. In July 1945, mere weeks after the Allies celebrated victory, Churchill was booted from office faster than you can say, change of pace. The general election results were as shocking as finding out your favorite band is disbanding. The Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee, surged to power, promising a bold new social agenda that resonated with a public weary from years of sacrifice. Churchill's Conservatives were left in the dust, securing only 197 seats to Labour's 393 in the House of Commons. The voters, it seemed, were ready for social security, not speeches, housing, not heroics. Why the sudden switch? Well, Churchill, for all his wartime bravado, was as equipped for domestic policy as a fish is for tap dancing. The electorate didn't want bulldogs anymore. They wanted bulldozers for reconstruction. The Labour Party's manifesto, promising nationalisation of key industries, full employment, and the creation of the National Health Service, was music to the ears of a population ready to rebuild a fairer society. Churchill, by contrast, was seen as a relic of the war era, with policies that felt like yesterday's news. Now, let's not paint Churchill as some political dinosaur who couldn't adapt. Post-defeat, he wasn't sulking in a corner, but rather he was out there, trying his hand at hobbies that, frankly, make for some delightful anecdotes. First, there was his painting, an endeavour that was more about personal therapy than public acclaim. Churchill took to painting like a duck to water, albeit a duck with a penchant for the Impressionists. He produced over 500 paintings, favouring landscapes and still lifes, which he completed with a zeal that could rival any art student on a deadline. For Churchill, wielding a paintbrush offered a reprieve from the relentless march of politics and the lingering spectre of his black dog. Then there was the small matter of bricklaying. Yes, you heard that right. Churchill, the stalwart defender of the free world, could often be found in his garden at Chartwell, trowel in hand, constructing walls as if fortifying his own personal bastion. He even joined the Amalgamated Union of Building Trade Workers, a membership that was as unexpected as a cat joining a dog show. Though the idea of Churchill in overalls is amusing, his masonry skills were no joke. He took to the craft with the same meticulous attention he applied to his political career, albeit with fewer casualties. But back to politics, because you didn't really think Churchill would stay away forever, did you? The post-war political landscape was shifting faster than a teenager's taste in music, and the Cold War was heating up like a kettle on full boil. In 1946, Churchill delivered what became known as the Iron Curtain speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. The speech was a wake-up call to the West, warning of the Soviet Union's expanding influence over Eastern Europe, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. It was a line that cut through the political fog like a lighthouse beam, highlighting the new geopolitical divide. The Iron Curtain speech was classic Churchill, blunt, bold, and heavy on the metaphor. It didn't just cement Churchill's role as a Cold War statesman, but also set the stage for the emerging East-West tensions. It was a reminder that while Churchill might have been out of office, his voice was still a heavyweight contender in the global arena. His warnings about the Soviet threat resonated with a world grappling with the uneasy transition from wartime alliances to peacetime rivalries. Churchill's ability to pivot from wartime leader to Cold War commentator was a testament to his knack for reinvention, a skill as necessary in politics as it is in pop culture. He adapted to the changing political landscapes with the agility of a cat on a hot tin roof, proving that even political titans can learn new tricks. Yet, while the Iron Curtain speech was a resounding success, not all of Churchill's post-war endeavours enjoyed equal acclaim. His later years in politics were marked by a mix of triumphs and missteps, much like a comeback album that doesn't quite capture the magic of the original. While Churchill's public life was replete with speeches and statesmanship, his private pursuits offered a glimpse into the man behind the myth. Whether painting a sun-dappled landscape or laying bricks under the English sky, Churchill was a study in contrasts, restless yet focused, driven yet contemplative. These hobbies were more than mere distractions. They were outlets for his boundless energy and titanic ego, a way to channel his restless spirit into something tangible. So, what do we make of Churchill's post-war period? It's a chapter marked by reinvention, resilience, and a refusal to fade quietly into the annals of history. It's the story of a leader who, despite setbacks, remained a towering figure on the world stage, as adept with a brush as he was with a policy speech. In a world where leaders often struggle to transition from wartime to peacetime roles, Churchill navigated the choppy waters with a mixture of grit and grace. As we wrap up this section, Churchill's story stands as a testament to the enduring power of reinvention. Man who once rallied a nation with his indomitable spirit found new ways to express his creativity and influence the world, proving that even in the face of defeat, the human spirit can shine as brightly as ever. But hold onto your hats, because Churchill's journey is far from over, with more twists and turns left in this remarkable tale. Stay tuned, dear listeners, for there's more to come in the saga of Winston Churchill. Churchill's story, like a complex symphony, now approached its final movement, filled with both triumphal crescendos and somber refrains. As the 1950s dawned, the political tides once again shifted, and in an unexpected encore, Churchill found himself back on the center stage as Prime Minister in 1951. That's right, like a rock star who just couldn't stay retired, Churchill returned to the helm at the ripe old age of 76. Now, if you're imagining a sprightly elder statesman ready to tackle the challenges of a new decade with youthful vigor, you might want to temper those expectations. Old Winston was more akin to a vintage car, full of style and history, but prone to the odd breakdown. His second stint as Prime Minister was marked by a Britain recovering from the war's devastation, a country eager to move forward while still clutching its past. The economy was a mixed bag of post-war austerity and burgeoning consumerism, with rationing still a reality until 1954. Churchill's focus was less on domestic reform and more on maintaining Britain's global influence, a task that required the finesse of a diplomat and the patience of a saint. His health, however, was about as cooperative as a cat on a leash. He suffered a series of strokes, the first in 1953, which were kept as tightly under wraps as the Colonel's secret recipe. Despite these health challenges, Churchill was determined to project an image of resilience, a testament to his indomitable spirit, or perhaps sheer stubbornness. Under Churchill's leadership, Britain grappled with its diminishing empire, a reality as bitter as cold tea. The sun was setting on the British Empire faster than you could say decolonization, with countries like India and Pakistan having already gained independence in 1947. Churchill, ever the imperialist at heart, struggled with this new world order. His vision of Britain as a global power clashed with the emerging geopolitical realities, where the United States and the Soviet Union were the new kids on the block, with nuclear arsenals to match. It's a bit like trying to bring a sword to a gunfight, impressive in its own way, but ultimately futile. Churchill's later years in office weren't without their achievements, though. His efforts to strengthen the Anglo-American relationship bore fruit, as did his attempts to ease Cold War tensions. In 1953, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, not for his oratory, but for his historical writings, a nod to his prolific output that had kept creditors at bay during leaner times. His sixth volume, The Second World War, is a masterclass in narrative history, blending meticulous research with a flair for the dramatic. It's the kind of bedtime reading that could put an insomniac to sleep, or keep a history buff up all night. By 1955, Churchill's health had deteriorated to the point where even his legendary tenacity couldn't keep him in office. He retired as Prime Minister, leaving behind a legacy as complex as a Rubik's Cube. His departure marked the end of an era, both for Britain and for Churchill himself, who retreated to his beloved Chartwell, where he could paint landscapes and lay bricks to his heart's content. He remained a member of Parliament until 1964, though his role was largely symbolic, a living monument to a bygone age. Now, let's tackle the myth of Churchill, the infallible hero, a narrative as enduring as a Hollywood blockbuster. It's true that his leadership during World War II cemented him as a symbol of defiance and perseverance. His speeches were like verbal steroids for a nation in need of a morale boost. But Churchill was no saint. His views on race and empire, not to mention his handling of events like the Bengal famine of 1943, where his policies contributed to the deaths of millions, paint a more complex picture. These are the uncomfortable truths that history often glosses over in favor of the more palatable legend. So how do we remember Churchill today? Is he the savior of free Europe or an embodiment of the British imperial mindset? The answer is both, and therein lies the beauty and the curse of legacy. Churchill's life is a tapestry of achievements and failures, a reminder that even the most revered figures are fallible. He was a man of contradictions, a die-hard imperialist who championed democracy, a brilliant strategist with a penchant for blunders, a leader whose charisma could inspire armies while his policies sometimes alienated allies. Yet, his influence on modern leadership is undeniable. Churchill's ability to communicate a vision, to inspire and unite, remains a benchmark for leaders across the globe. His speeches are studied not just for their rhetorical brilliance, but for their ability to galvanize a nation. His resilience in the face of adversity, his refusal to surrender to the black dog, offers a lesson in the power of personal strength. In a world where leaders are often scrutinized under the harshest of lights, Churchill stands as a testament to the complexity of human character. As we close the book on Winston Churchill's story, we do so with a nod to his enduring legacy. He was a man who embodied the spirit of his age, a figure whose life was as colorful as the landscapes he loved to paint. His story is one of triumph and tragedy, of brilliance and bluster, a reminder that history is not black and white, but a rich tapestry of shades. And so, we leave him where he belongs, at the heart of our collective memory, a giant of his time whose shadow still looms large over the landscape of modern leadership. Your day kicks off with the sun peeking over the Aegean, casting a warm glow on your humble abode. Before the rooster even thinks about crowing, you're already up and contemplating breakfast. Not that there's much to ponder. Let's face it, the morning menu in ancient Greece is about as predictable as Zeus throwing a thunderbolt. You're staring at a loaf of barley bread, or *Marsa* if you're feeling particularly Greek today, alongside a cup of watered-down wine that's more H2O than Dionysian delight. This isn't brunch with the gods, it's survival with a side of reality. Barley bread is your go-to because wheat is basically the celebrity grain. Everyone wants it, but not everyone can afford it. Barley, on the other hand, is the grain of the people. It's cheaper, hardier, and frankly, more down-to-earth. While modern folks might balk at a breakfast devoid of avocado toast and latte art, this humble meal is your lifeline. It's simple, sure, but it's fuel for the day ahead. And let's be honest, your ancestors didn't have Instagram to impress with photogenic meals. Now, let's talk economics, because if you think buying groceries today is tough, try navigating the ancient Greek grain market. Barley was the backbone of Greek sustenance, and not just for breakfast. It was the staple ingredient that kept the populace going. The reason. It's all about supply and demand, baby. Greece's rocky terrain isn't exactly the Kansas of the ancient world. With only 20% of the land arable, every grain was a precious commodity. Barley fields stretched across the landscape, soaking up the Mediterranean sun, while bustling trade routes ensured this vital resource flowed where it was needed. Speaking of trade routes, they're the ancient world's version of Amazon Prime, albeit at a much slower pace. Ships laden with grain plied the waters from the Black Sea to Egypt, creating a web of commerce that kept granaries stocked and bakers busy. But it wasn't just about moving product. It was about politics, power, and keeping the populace from revolting over empty bellies. Grain wasn't just food. It was currency, leverage, and sometimes a cause for war. But let's not get too carried away with visions of grand maritime adventures. Life was simpler and harsher than the romantic visions of ancient Greece might suggest. Sure, those frescoes and statues depict a world of beauty and leisure, but the reality was more about making sure you had enough to eat and staying out of the way of marauding Spartans. Your breakfast of barley bread and wine is less a culinary experience and more a reminder of the balance between nature's bounty and humanity's struggle. The Mediterranean climate is your ally and adversary in this delicate dance. The warm, dry summers and mild, wet winters are perfect for growing barley, olives and grapes, but they also mean that agriculture is a gamble with nature's whims. One bad season, and suddenly it's not just your breakfast that's in jeopardy, but the whole community's survival. Those idyllic images of Greek fields swaying in the breeze, they come with the harsh reality that every harvest is a roll of the dice. And let's debunk a myth while we're at it. The idea of a lavish Greek breakfast is about as realistic as a minotaur, and no, that's not a breakfast option either. The ancients didn't wake up to feasts, they woke up to necessity. Simplicity was the rule of the day, not because they were minimalists, but because they were practical. Austerity wasn't a choice. It was a necessity born from the economic and environmental realities of their time. So, as you munch on your barley bread, swigging wine that's more like grape-flavored water, you're not just having breakfast. You're participating in a ritual that connects you to the land, the trade networks, and the relentless march of history. It's a moment grounded in the earthiness of the grain and the hard truths of ancient life. And as you set down your cup, you might just appreciate the stark beauty of that reality, devoid of frills but full of meaning. And so, with your morning ritual of barley bread and watered-down wine behind you, it's time to navigate the culinary landscape of ancient Greek midday meals. Forget your modern lunch breaks with artisanal sandwiches and sushi rolls. In Athens, the midday meal, or ariston, is a bit more rustic. Think Mediterranean diet before it was cool. Let's start with the holy trinity of Greek sustenance: olives, figs, and cheese. These three are the Beyonce, Jay-Z, and blue ivy of ancient Greek food, each playing a starring role in the Athenian diet. Olives, in particular, are the unsung heroes of Greek cuisine. Not only do they provide a rich source of calories and fat, essential for the hard-working Athenian, but they also produce olive oil, the liquid gold that fuels everything from cooking to lighting your humble abode. And let's not forget, olive oil is a key player in the ancient Olympic Games, used to anoint athletes, proving once again that Greeks really did oil up for everything. Figs, on the other hand, are nature's candy, offering a sweet reprieve from the day's toil. They're packed with fiber and nutrients, making them a staple for anyone looking to keep things, well, regular. Figs also have a certain mythological allure, being associated with Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry. Imagine that, a fruit that's both health food and a party icon. Then there's cheese, the dairy delight that brings it all together. But before you picture a decadent cheese board, remember that we're talking simple goat or sheep's milk cheese. It's tangy, nutritious, and crucially, it doesn't spoil easily, making it the perfect companion for the ancient Greek on the go. Now, let's take a stroll to the beating heart of Athens, the Agora. This bustling marketplace is the epicenter of economic and social life. It's where Athenians haggle over prices like it's a sport. If you're picturing a quaint farmer's market, think again. The Agora is more like the Wall Street of food, with prices fluctuating based on supply, demand, and sometimes sheer luck. Here's a fun fact. The price of an average meal could vary day by day, depending on what's available. Olives and figs are staples, sure, but other goods, like fish or grains, can be as unpredictable as the Greek gods themselves. Speaking of which, the Agora is also a place where social class is as visible as a toga at a nudist beach. Wealthy Athenians have the drachmas to splurge on imported delicacies. Think honey from Crete or wine from Chios, while the average citizen makes do with local produce. And let's debunk another myth while we're here. The idea of the opulent Greek feast. Sure, the wealthy might indulge in lavish banquets, but for most Athenians, meals are about sustenance, not spectacle. The notion of an endless, extravagant feast is more poetic license than historical fact. In reality, the typical Athenian meal is modest, a reflection of both the land's bounty and its limitations. But don't let that spoil the romance entirely. There's something profoundly human about gathering at the Agora, surrounded by the cacophony of life, the barter, the chatter, the occasional philosophical debate, because hey, it's Athens. It's a reminder that food is more than just fuel. It's a social glue, a way to connect with your fellow citizens, even as you haggle over a basket of olives. As you take in the sights and sounds of the Agora, it's easy to see why the Greeks were so philosophical. When every meal is a negotiation with nature and your fellow man, it sparks a certain introspection. You might even start pondering the deeper meaning of life between bites of cheese, or maybe that's just the fig talking. So, as you navigate this ancient marketplace, remember that each olive, fig, and wheel of cheese carries the weight of history. They're not just ingredients. They're symbols of a culture that thrived on the edge of necessity and innovation. And as you savor your simple midday meal, you're part of a timeless story, one where necessity is not just the mother of invention, but also the mother of lunch. Stay tuned, because next time we'll dive even deeper into the intricate dance of class, cuisine, and culture in ancient Greece. The story's far from over, and there's much more to chew on, both literally and figuratively. As the midday sun begins its descent, casting longer shadows across the Agora, you might find yourself contemplating the next culinary chapter of the day. We've grazed through the marketplace, and now it's time to roll up our metaphorical sleeves and dive into the ancient Greek kitchen, a place where the art of cooking meets the reality of survival. Now, when I say kitchen, don't get carried away with visions of stainless steel appliances and granite countertops. No, the ancient Greek kitchen is more Flintstones than Jetsons. Picture clay ovens that look like they belong in a rustic pottery barn, and open fires that double as both heat source and potential smoke inhalation hazard. Our culinary ancestors weren't wielding fancy gadgets. They were making do with what their environment provided, a testament to human ingenuity, and let's be honest, a bit of a fire hazard. Cooking in ancient Greece was a communal affair, often taking place in the courtyard of a household. Here, you find a cast of characters that modern kitchens rarely see. Women and slaves were the primary chefs, serving as the unsung heroes of the Greek culinary scene. While the men of the house might fancy themselves as philosophers or warriors, it was the women and slaves who kept the home fires burning, literally. This division of labor wasn't just a matter of tradition. It was a reflection of the societal structure that defined ancient life. Women, relegated to the domestic sphere, were tasked with meal preparation, while slaves handled the heavy lifting. It's a setup that might seem archaic, but it's crucial to understand how deeply it shaped the day-to-day realities of Greek life. Let's not sugarcoat it. The kitchen was a microcosm of the larger social order, a place where the lines between class and gender were as clear as the Aegean Sea on a sunny day. The role of women in the kitchen was both empowering and restrictive, a paradox as old as time. They wielded the power of sustenance, yet their contributions were often overlooked in the grand narrative of history. Slaves, on the other hand, were the backbone of the culinary operation, performing the laborious tasks that kept the household running. Their contributions were vital, yet they existed in a world where freedom was as foreign as a Spartan in a toga. Now, onto the tools of the trade. The clay oven, or Klebanos asterisk, deserves a moment in the spotlight. This ingenious creation was the ancient Greek answer to the modern oven, a dome-shaped structure that could reach temperatures high enough to bake bread and roast meat. It was the culinary equivalent of a Swiss Army knife, versatile and essential for any respectable Greek household. Then there were the open fires, the heart of the ancient kitchen. Cooking over an open flame was both an art and a science, requiring skill and patience to avoid a charred disaster. These fires were the crucible in which the flavors of Greece were forged, where simple ingredients were transformed into meals that sustained a civilization. If you're wondering about the menu, let's delve into the culinary mindset of the time. This is where figures like Art Chestratus come into play. Known as the Homer of cooking, Art Chestratus penned one of the earliest known cookbooks, *Hedepatheia*, around 350 BCE. His work was part travelogue, part culinary guide, offering a glimpse into the tastes and preferences of ancient Greece. Art Chestratus was a man of refined palate, advocating for simple, high-quality ingredients over elaborate preparations. He had a penchant for fish, which he believed should be cooked with minimal fuss to let its natural flavors shine through. In a world where salt was gold dust and spices were rare, the Greek approach to cooking was all about celebrating the integrity of the ingredients. But hold on. Before you start imagining a world of gastronomic delights, let's bust the myth of the ever-delicious ancient Greek meal. The truth is, the food wasn't always as mouth-watering as we might imagine. Preservation techniques were rudimentary at best, meaning that ingredients could spoil quickly. Salt was the primary preservative, used to cure meats and fish, but it could only do so much. Fresh produce was seasonal, and the lack of refrigeration meant that meals had to be consumed quickly. The ancient diet was a celebration of what was available rather than a pursuit of culinary perfection. It's a culinary philosophy that resonates with the farm-to-table movement of today, but for the Greeks, it was less about choice and more about necessity. They made do with what they had, finding ways to enhance flavors with herbs like oregano, thyme, and coriander. These herbs were the secret weapons of the ancient cook, adding depth and complexity to dishes that might otherwise have been a bit one-note. And let's not forget that cooking was as much about survival as it was about sustenance. The art of preserving food was crucial, especially during the lean months when fresh produce was scarce. Pickling, drying, and fermenting were common practices, ensuring that the pantry was stocked, even when the fields weren't. It was a constant battle against the clock, a race to use ingredients before they turned, a dance with the elements that defined the ancient Greek culinary experience. So, as you stand in the kitchen of antiquity, surrounded by the crackle of open flames and the aroma of roasting meat, you might find yourself reflecting on the timeless nature of cooking. It's a craft that connects us to our past, a reminder that while the tools may have changed, the essence of cooking remains the same. It's about transforming the raw into the remarkable, nourishing both body and soul with the bounty of the earth. As the afternoon fades into evening, the stage is set for the next act in our culinary journey. The sun may be setting, but the story is far from over. Ahead lies the rich tapestry of Greek dining, where meals become gatherings and food becomes a celebration of community. Stay tuned, because there's much more to uncover in the kitchens of ancient Greece, where history and gastronomy intertwine to create a legacy that's as enduring as it is delicious. As the evening sky dons its dusky hues, you're primed for the piece de resistance of the ancient Greek culinary day. Dinner. Forget your modern notion of a three-course meal. This is about sustenance, status, and sometimes subtle social maneuvering. The Greeks knew how to turn a simple meal into a cultural cornerstone, weaving together the threads of everyday life with the grandeur of their myths and religious practices. Let's start with the main attraction, fish. In ancient Greece, fish wasn't just a dietary staple. It was a status symbol, a slippery little marker of your place on the social ladder. The Aegean Sea was a veritable seafood buffet, and the Greeks took full advantage, hauling in everything from sardines to the more elusive tuna. But here's the catch, pun intended. Fish wasn't always on the menu for your average citizen. Fresh fish could be pricey, a luxury that the average Athenian couldn't always afford. Instead, they often settled for dried or salted fish, a more economical option that still delivered a taste of the sea. Now, before you romanticize the idea of a Greek fish fry, let's be clear. This wasn't a culinary delight by today's standards. The preservation methods left much to be desired, and the seasoning was sparse, relying heavily on salt and the occasional splash of lemon for flavor. But what it lacked in gourmet appeal, it made up for in practicality. Fish was a protein powerhouse, essential for a population that spent its days engaged in physical labor or, for the more philosophical types, intense bouts of thinking. And let's not forget the legumes, those humble, hardy heroes of the ancient Greek diet. Lentils, chickpeas, and beans were the backbone of many a meal, offering sustenance when meat was scarce. These little legumes were the ancient equivalent of a superfood, packed with protein and fiber, and they played a crucial role in the Greek diet. They were also cheap and easy to store, making them a reliable food source throughout the year. In fact, lentil soup, known as *fake*, was a staple dish, often seasoned with olive oil, vinegar, and herbs to add a bit of zest to the otherwise plain fare. You might be wondering how the Greeks balanced these ingredients with their religious practices. After all, the gods were as much a part of daily life as the food on the table. Well, the Greeks were nothing if not resourceful. They incorporated their religious observances into their meals, making offerings to the gods before sitting down to eat. This wasn't just about appeasing the deities. It was a way to reinforce community bonds and remind everyone of their place in the cosmos. Sacrifices were common, and while the gods got the best cuts, the humans made do with what was left, often the very fish and legumes that graced their tables. Of course, no discussion of ancient Greek dining would be complete without a nod to the symposium. Now, here's where the myth-busting gets interesting. The word symposium might conjure images of grand feasts and lively debates, but let's set the record straight. These gatherings were less about the food and more about the conversation, and let's be honest, the wine. Lots and lots of wine. The Greeks were masters of moderation, at least in theory, and they diluted their wine with water as a nod to civility. But in practice, these symposia often turned into a bit of a bacchanal, with revelers waxing philosophical over cups of the finest vintage. The symposium was a social event, a chance for the elite to flex their intellectual muscles and occasionally their biceps in feats of strength. It was part debate club, part drinking party, and entirely an expression of Greek culture. But if you're picturing a scene of opulent dining, think again. The focus was on the conversation, not the cuisine. Simple fare like bread, olives, and cheese was served to soak up the wine, allowing the attendees to keep the revelry going long into the night. And while the symposium holds a certain romantic allure, let's not ignore its exclusionary nature. Women were generally not invited, unless they were courtesans or entertainers, and the gatherings were very much a male-dominated affair. It was a reflection of the broader social order, where the lines between public and private life were clearly drawn. So, as you settle in for this ancient Greek dinner, you're not just partaking in a meal. You're participating in a cultural tradition that transcends mere sustenance. You're engaging with the guards, your fellow diners, and the very essence of what it meant to be Greek. It's a dance of flavors and philosophies, a testament to the Greeks' ability to find meaning in the mundane. As the night deepens and the stars begin their celestial waltz, you're left with the lingering taste of history on your palate. It's a reminder that dining in ancient Greece was more than just an act of consumption. It was a celebration of life in all its complexity. And as you lay down your cup and retire for the evening, you're not just closing a chapter on your day. You're stepping into the ongoing narrative of human civilization, where every meal tells a story, and every story is a feast for the mind. As the evening air cools and the Aegean stars make their twinkling debut, let's mull over the central role of food in ancient Greek society, a role that transcended mere sustenance and seeped into the very fabric of power, politics, and culture. Food wasn't just something you consumed. It was a tool, a weapon, and a cultural ambassador, all rolled into one. First, let's tackle the political power plays involving grain, the ancient world's version of an oil reserve. Control the grain, control the game. Athens, with its hunger for wheat, became heavily reliant on imports, particularly from the Black Sea region. We're talking about a city-state that consumed upwards of 17,000 tons of grain annually. To put it into perspective, that's like trying to feed a small modern city with a diet heavy on the carbs. Given Greece's rocky soil and limited arable land, only about 20% was fit for farming. Athens had no choice but to look outward. Enter the grain fleets, the lifeline of Athens, snaking their way through the Mediterranean like ancient food delivery services. These ships were as crucial to Athens as the Parthenon itself, ensuring the city didn't starve, and importantly, didn't revolt. Grain was currency, and whoever controlled it could wield significant power. It was a precarious balance, a tightrope walk where a single bad harvest or a blockade could tip the scales from stability to chaos. The Peloponnesian War, for instance, saw Athens desperately safeguarding its grain routes from Spartan interference, because nothing says we're serious about this war like fighting over bread. But the political intrigue surrounding grain didn't stop at borders. Athens implemented the ***, or grain guardians, a group tasked with regulating the grain market and preventing price gouging. These guys were the ancient equivalent of the FDA, ensuring that no crafty merchant could turn a quick drachma by hoarding wheat. This wasn't just about economics, it was about survival. Keeping the populace fed was as much a political strategy as it was an act of governance. Yet, the influence of Greek culinary practices stretched far beyond its shores. Greek colonies and trading posts dotted the Mediterranean like sprinkles on a baklava, spreading their love for olives, wine, and yes, even barley bread, wherever they went. Greek cuisine became the culinary lingua franca of the ancient world, influencing Roman dining habits, and by extension, Western culinary traditions. The Greeks weren't just exporting food, they were exporting a way of life, a philosophy that emphasized simplicity, balance, and the celebration of local ingredients. This culinary diaspora was no accident. Greeks understood the power of culture as a tool of soft diplomacy. Food was a way to win hearts and minds, a tasty enticement for other cultures to engage in trade and alliance. The spread of Greek culinary customs was as strategic as it was organic, an ancient form of globalization that left its mark on history. Now, let's address the myths that have clung to Greek cuisine like honey on a fig. The romantic notion of Greeks lounging around, feasting on sumptuous spreads, while waxing lyrical about the cosmos. It's about as realistic as expecting Zeus to pop in for dinner. Most Greeks ate simply and sparingly, driven more by necessity than by choice. The opulence of Greek cuisine, much like the gods themselves, was more myth than reality for the average Athenian. Yet, these myths endure because they capture our imaginations. The idea of a world where food, philosophy, and pleasure are intertwined speaks to a deep-seated desire for a life rich in meaning and experience. And while the reality was far more modest, the allure of those myths is undeniable. They offer a glimpse into a world where every meal was a connection to the divine, a chance to partake in the bounty of the earth and the wisdom of the ages. So, as we wrap up this culinary odyssey through ancient Greece, what does all this tell us about human nature? Well, if history has taught us anything, it's that food is never just food. It's a mirror reflecting our values, our struggles, and our aspirations. It's a testament to our ingenuity, our resilience, and our relentless pursuit of something more, a better life, a richer experience, a connection to something greater than ourselves. In the end, the legacy of Greek cuisine is a reminder of the enduring power of culture to transcend time and space. It's a story of adaptation and survival, of turning humble ingredients into something profound. And as we continue to gather around our tables, whether in Athens or New York, that legacy lives on, reminding us that while the world may change, the fundamental human desire for nourishment, in body, mind, and spirit, remains the same. So, next time you bite into an olive or savor a piece of feta, take a moment to appreciate the journey it's taken. From the rocky hills of ancient Greece to your plate, it's a story as rich and complex as history itself. And as you digest these tales of culinary adventure, you might find yourself reflecting on the timeless dance of necessity and creativity that defines us all. Because if there's one thing the Greeks understood, it's that life, like a good meal, is best savored in all its messy, magnificent glory. Aristotle, the man who would one day earn the title of the philosopher, wasn't always the revered sage of ancient Greece. In fact, his beginnings were as humble as they come, hailing from the small northern town of Stagira, a place that was about as glamorous as a pair of ancient sandals. Born in 384 BC, Aristotle's early life was steeped in the bustling and often chaotic world of Macedonian politics. His father, Nicomachus, was the physician to King Amyntas Roman III, which, if you think about it, was a bit like being the personal doctor to a medieval king. You got to know all the royal secrets, but there was always the risk of losing your head if you prescribed the wrong herb. Despite these high-stakes house calls, Aristotle's early life wasn't exactly a non-stop thrill ride. Stagira, with its population barely reaching a few thousand, was more of a dot on the map than a cultural hub. Yet, this little town would shape one of history's greatest minds. Aristotle was a curious kid, the kind who would more likely be found poking at bugs than playing hoplite and barbarian with the other children. He had a penchant for observation, which would eventually become a cornerstone of his philosophical method. At the age of 17, young Aristotle packed his bags, probably a modest satchel, and headed to Athens to study at Plato's academy. Now, if you're imagining the academy as some kind of Hogwarts for philosophers, think again. It was more like an open-air TED talk that never ended. Founded by Plato in 387 BC, the academy was situated in a grove of olive trees, which sounds serene until you remember that ancient Athenian streets were basically open sewers. Still, it was the intellectual heart of Athens, a city that was the ancient equivalent of New York in terms of cultural and political clout. Walking into the academy, Aristotle must have felt every bit the country boy. His Macedonian accent would have stuck out like a sore thumb among the sophisticated Athenians. Picture it. Here's this earnest young man, fresh from Stagira, trying to wrap his head around Plato's teachings on ideal forms, a concept that was as elusive as trying to nail jelly to a wall. Plato's idea was that everything in the material world was a mere shadow of its perfect form, which exists in some higher realm. To Aristotle, who preferred things he could prod and dissect, this was like being told that the real essence of a frog wasn't the slimy, croaky thing in front of him, but some perfect, ethereal frog up in the sky. Despite these philosophical differences, Aristotle was a standout student. He spent a good 20 years under Plato's tutelage, which tells you two things. He was either a very patient student, or the academy's graduation requirements were tougher than Harvard's. During this time, Aristotle honed his skills in rhetoric, ethics, natural sciences, and pretty much anything else that had a scroll written about it. Yet, even as he absorbed Plato's teachings, he was already beginning to question them. Where Plato saw forms and ideals, Aristotle saw substance and reality. It was a bit like being taught by a Jedi master who insists the Force is all around you, while you're more interested in how the lightsaber actually works. This difference in thought wasn't just academic, it had real-world implications. The Greece of Aristotle's time was a politically fragmented land, with city-states like Athens and Sparta constantly vying for power. Understanding human nature, governance, and ethics wasn't just an intellectual exercise, it was crucial for survival. Aristotle's grounding in the practicalities of life in Stagira perhaps gave him a unique perspective. Where Plato might dream of philosopher kings, Aristotle was more inclined to consider the nuts and bolts of how societies actually functioned. In this way, the young philosopher began to carve out a niche for himself, blending observational rigor with philosophical inquiry. He wasn't content with abstract musings. He wanted to know how things worked, whether it was the human body, the mechanics of the heavens, or the intricacies of a city-state's politics. This approach made him something of a misfit among Plato's followers, who were more likely to debate the nature of beauty than to get their hands dirty in empirical research. It's worth noting that Aristotle's time at the Academy coincided with Athens' golden age, a period of unmatched cultural and intellectual flourishing. The city was a melting pot of ideas and debates, from the latest in drama and art to cutting-edge discussions on politics and ethics. Imagine a place where Socrates, Plato, and later Aristotle were all part of the same intellectual scene. It was like the ultimate Greek symposium, a heady mix of wine, wit, and wisdom. But even in this vibrant setting, Aristotle's Macedonian roots were never far from the surface. The Athenians, with their penchant for democracy and philosophical idealism, often viewed Macedonians as rustic outsiders. Yet, Aristotle's upbringing may have given him a grounded perspective that his more idealistic peers lacked. He was less interested in chasing abstract ideals and more focused on understanding the world as it was, a trait that would define his later work. As Aristotle's time at the Academy drew to a close, his relationship with Plato became a bit of a philosophical tug-of-war. Despite their differences, there was mutual respect. Plato reportedly referred to Aristotle as the mind of the school, which is quite a compliment when you consider that the school was literally full of minds. However, when Plato died in 347 BC, the philosophical landscape shifted, and Aristotle found himself at a crossroads. With no clear path in Athens, Aristotle made the somewhat surprising decision to leave the city. It was a move that would take him far beyond the olive groves of the Academy, setting the stage for the next chapter of his life, a chapter that would see him evolve from a curious student into one of history's most influential thinkers. But before he could reshape the intellectual world, Aristotle had to navigate the political and cultural complexities of a rapidly changing Greece, a journey that would eventually bring him back to the Macedonian court and into the orbit of another legendary figure, Alexander the Great. But that's a story for another time. For now, let's savor the image of young Aristotle, a Macedonian in Athens, caught between the allure of lofty ideals and the undeniable pull of the tangible world, with a few frogs tossed in for good measure. As Aristotle left the olive groves of Athens behind, his path led him right back to the Macedonian court, a place where the air was thick with ambition and intrigue, and not just from the herbal concoctions of court physicians. Picture it, a philosopher fresh off the intellectual roller coaster of Plato's Academy, now tasked with tutoring a young Alexander, the future great, a boy with more energy than a barrel of Athenian wine at a symposium. Could say Aristotle was signing up for a job that came with both high stakes and high drama, like being a life coach to a budding rock star with a penchant for world domination. Alexander, born in 356 BC, was the heir to a kingdom that was as ambitious as it was tumultuous. His father, King Philip Roman II of Macedon, had big dreams of uniting the fractious Greek city-states under Macedonian rule. Not your average family business. Right. And so, in 343 BC, when Philip tapped Aristotle to educate his 13-year-old son, the philosopher stepped into a role that was part mentor, part babysitter, part political strategist. You can almost imagine the job description. Must love philosophy, have experience with teenage rulers, and be okay with the occasional siege. Managing Alexander was no walk in the agora. This wasn't just any teenager. This was a kid who, by legend, tamed the impassable horse, Bucephalus, at age 12. Aristotle's task was to infuse his young charge with the wisdom of the ages, all while Alexander was likely more interested in the finer points of military strategy than in moral virtues or metaphysical debates. But Aristotle was nothing if not persistent. He believed in the power of education to shape character, and he took this gig seriously. Let's talk logistics. The Macedonian court, not exactly known for its philosophical leanings, was a far cry from the intellectual salons of Athens. Yet, Aristotle managed to carve out a mini-academy of sorts at the Temple of the Nymphs, near Mieza. a Macedonian equivalent of a classroom with a view. It was here that Aristotle attempted to impart his knowledge on subjects ranging from ethics to politics to natural sciences. He even dabbled in the not-so-light subject of zoology, because why not try to interest a future conqueror in the mating habits of Macedonian beetles? Aristotle's approach to education was surprisingly modern. He believed in teaching through dialogue and inquiry, encouraging Alexander to question everything, a lesson that might have backfired a bit given Alexander's later penchant for questioning the sovereignty of entire empires. Aristotle didn't just focus on rote learning. He aimed to cultivate a well-rounded leader, someone versed in both the arts of peace and war. This was a bit like trying to teach a hurricane about the virtues of a gentle breeze. Now, how much did Aristotle actually influence Alexander's global ambitions? The jury is still out on that one. On the one hand, Alexander carried a copy of Homer's Iliad, annotated by Aristotle himself, suggesting a deep respect for his tutor's intellect. On the other hand, the young conqueror's tactical decisions often seemed more inspired by ambition and audacity than philosophical musings. It's almost as if Alexander took Aristotle's teachings as mere suggestions, kind of like how a teenager might interpret curfew rules. But let's not sell Aristotle short. His teachings on ethics and politics likely provided some framework for Alexander's vision of a unified empire. Aristotle's idea of a balanced life, valuing reason and virtue, might have echoed in Alexander's efforts to blend cultures across his empire. Then again, the philosopher's ethnocentric views, that Greeks were naturally superior to non-Greeks, didn't exactly discourage Alexander from seeing himself as the destined ruler of the known world. It's a classic case of influence and consequence, or possibly philosopher and chaos. While Aristotle aimed to instill virtue and wisdom, his influence had its limits. The philosopher's pragmatic views on governance were often overshadowed by Alexander's charismatic, daredevil approach to leadership. Aristotle might have advocated for a measured, ethical rule, but Alexander, more rock-star than sage, preferred a thrilling, albeit risky, conquest. It's like trying to keep a lid on a pot of boiling water. The steam was bound to burst forth eventually. Economically and politically, Aristotle's time with Alexander was also a lesson in the cost of ambition. The Macedonian court wasn't just a place of power plays. It was a hotbed of political maneuvering, with financial implications that would rival any modern corporate boardroom drama. The resources required to fund Alexander's future campaigns would be colossal, influencing everything from taxation to trade. Aristotle's teachings on economics, though not as well documented, likely hinted at the complexities of managing such a vast realm, a topic Alexander would grapple with as he expanded his empire. Despite the philosophical chasm between teacher and student, Aristotle's presence in Alexander's formative years was undeniably significant. Their relationship was a complex weave of admiration and independence, one that shaped the course of history in ways both direct and subtle. Aristotle's lessons may not have tempered Alexander's warrior spirit, but they certainly added layers to his understanding of governance and human nature. It was a dynamic that would continue to unfold as Alexander set his sights beyond the borders of Macedon, leaving a legacy both monumental and controversial. As Aristotle watched his star pupil embark on a path of unprecedented conquest, he might have pondered the age-old question: can knowledge truly temper ambition, or are some forces of nature, like teenage conquerors, best left to their own devices? What's certain is that Aristotle's teachings, whether he realized it or not, became a part of the foundation upon which Alexander built his awe-inspiring, albeit transient, empire. And as the philosopher continued his own journey, the lessons learned at the Macedonian court would echo through his later works, leaving an indelible mark on the tapestry of history. As Aristotle bade farewell to the Macedonian court, perhaps with a wry smile and a sigh of relief, he must have pondered what kind of whirlwind he'd been caught in. The philosopher was ready to trade in the drama of royal tutelage for the intellectual hustle and bustle of Athens. But Athens, circa 335 BC, wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet. In fact, it was more like a welcome mat that had seen better days. The city was still reeling from its own political dramas, and the economic landscape was about as stable as a three-legged table on a windy day. Yet, Aristotle returned to Athens with a mission, to set up a school that would make even Plato's academy look like a mere warm-up act. Enter the Lyceum, which wasn't just a building but a bold statement. Think of it as Aristotle's intellectual playground, where he could finally let his ideas run wild. But starting a school wasn't just about hanging a sign and waiting for the eager minds to roll in. Oh no, Aristotle had to deal with some very real-world problems, like how to fund this grand enterprise. So let's talk drachmas, because founding a school wasn't cheap. We're not talking about a few scrolls and a couple of benches here. Aristotle needed a space that could accommodate his growing reputation and his even larger ambitions. The Lyceum was located just outside the city walls, in a gymnasium that had seen better days but still had potential. It was the kind of place that, with the right investment, could become a hub for the brightest minds of the time. But money was tight. Athens wasn't exactly flush with cash, and Aristotle's financial backers in Macedon weren't in a hurry to fund what they might have seen as an intellectual vanity project. Despite these financial hurdles, Aristotle was nothing if not resourceful. He cobbled together funds from various patrons, likely a mix of wealthy Athenians who saw the value in supporting a school that promised to teach everything from philosophy to biology. And let's be real, Aristotle's name carried weight. Even those who didn't quite understand his obsession with categorizing everything from politics to plants were willing to bet on his potential to produce the next generation of Greek thinkers. Aristotle's Lyceum wasn't your run-of-the-mill school. It was more like a one-man university, where the curriculum was as eclectic as Aristotle's own interests. We're talking about a place where you could start your morning with a discussion on ethics, dive into a midday lecture on the anatomy of marine life, and end the day pondering the finer points of political theory. If there was a manual for how to run an ancient Greek school, Aristotle probably tore it up and wrote his own. Now, let's address the students. Can you imagine their reactions? Picture a group of eager young Athenians, some of them fresh off the philosophical musings of Plato's followers, walking into the Lyceum only to be greeted by a lecture on animal dissection. How's that for a wake-up call? Aristotle's teaching style was hands-on, literally and figuratively. He believed in the power of observation and encouraged his students to question everything, from the workings of the human body to the nature of the cosmos. It was a bit like walking into a TED talk that had no set topic, just a speaker who could pivot from one subject to another with the ease of a seasoned intellectual gymnast. And here's where Aristotle truly stood out, his bizarrely diverse interests. We're not just talking a dabbler's curiosity. This was full-blown intellectual wanderlust. He didn't see boundaries between disciplines. To him, everything was connected. Politics, biology, ethics, they were all parts of a larger puzzle. His students had to be ready to jump from a debate on democracy to a deep dive into the reproductive habits of cuttlefish. It was like an ancient Greek version of a liberal arts education, minus the student loans, but with just as much head-scratching. But what was the point of all this intellectual acrobatics? For Aristotle, it was about understanding the world in its entirety. He wasn't content with philosophical navel-gazing. He wanted practical knowledge that could be applied to real-world problems. His work laid the groundwork for everything from political theory to the natural sciences. It's no exaggeration to say that Aristotle's Lyceum was a crucible for some of the most enduring ideas in Western thought. Of course, not everyone was thrilled with Aristotle's approach. Some traditionalists saw his eclectic style as a threat to the more rigid methods of teaching. But Aristotle wasn't about to conform. He was a rebel with a cause, determined to push the boundaries of what was considered proper education. His Lyceum was a reflection of his own restless curiosity, a place where questions were more important than answers, and where learning was an adventure, not a chore. And let's not forget the economic realities of running such an institution. Aristotle had to balance the books while juggling a roster of students who, let's face it, probably weren't paying top drachma for tuition. The Lyceum operated on a shoestring budget, relying on the goodwill of patrons and the occasional donation from admirers. It was a testament to Aristotle's charisma and reputation that he managed to keep the school afloat, even when financial storms threatened to sink it. In the end, Aristotle's return to Athens and the founding of the Lyceum was more than just a personal triumph. It was a pivotal moment in the history of education, a bold experiment that challenged the status quo and laid the foundation for centuries of intellectual inquiry. The Lyceum wasn't just a school. It was a symbol of the power of knowledge to transcend boundaries and transform societies. So as we leave Aristotle and his merry band of scholars deep in debate, dissecting everything from the ethics of leadership to the anatomy of earthworms, we can appreciate the audacity of his vision. He wasn't just teaching. He was building a legacy that would echo through history, shaping minds and molding ideas long after the last scroll had been penned. And that, dear friends, is how Aristotle carved his niche, not just as a philosopher, but as a pioneer of education, driven by an insatiable curiosity that knew no bounds. Now, before we dive headlong into Aristotle's philosophies, let's set the stage. The Athens of Aristotle's day wasn't just a city of marble columns and philosophical musings. It was a rough and tumble world where money talked and the poor walked. The stark economic realities of ancient Greece were about as glamorous as a pile of unwashed togas, and understanding this backdrop is key to grasping the practicality, or impracticality, of Aristotle's ideas. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is his magnum opus on the good life, or eudaimonia, if you want to impress your friends at a dinner party. But here's the kicker. Aristotle's vision of happiness wasn't exactly a one-size-fits-all kind of deal. He proposed that true happiness is achieved through virtuous activity in accordance with reason, which is all well and good if you've got the leisure time to ponder such existential questions. But for the average Athenian, who was probably more concerned with where their next amphora of olive oil was coming from, the idea of a life devoted to philosophical contemplation might have seemed about as attainable as a holiday on Mount Olympus. The economic context of Athens was as complex as a Socratic dialogue. Wealth disparity was rampant, with the elite few living in opulence while the masses toiled in relative poverty. Trade was the lifeblood of the Athenian economy, and while some citizens struck it rich from commerce, the majority were left eking out a living in what we now call the gig economy. Slavery, too, was an economic engine, and let's face it, Aristotle's ethics didn't exactly challenge the status quo on that front. He famously considered some people as natural slaves, a perspective that's about as palatable today as a cup of fermented fish sauce. Aristotle's Politics attempted to define the best forms of government, and he wasn't shy about ranking them. He held a soft spot for constitutional government, or what he called polity, where the middle class would wield power. And why the middle class? Because Aristotle thought they were the most stable, less prone to the excesses of the rich or the desperation of the poor. It's a bit like saying the middle sibling in a family is the most balanced. Debatable, but it sounds good on paper. But how practical was this notion of a balanced polity in reality? Given the constant power struggles and economic divides in Athens, such an ideal seems more like a philosophical pipe dream than a realistic blueprint. The city-states of Greece were often embroiled in conflicts, both internal and external, driven by the ambitions of their leaders and the whims of fortune. In this turbulent environment, Aristotle's balanced polity was probably about as likely as Zeus showing up to mediate a debate. Now, let's talk about Aristotle's famous concept of the golden mean, which suggests virtue lies between extremes. It's a nice idea, really, like finding the perfect balance between binge-watching and getting actual sleep. But in the high-stakes world of Greek politics, where decisions often meant life or death, finding that middle ground was easier said than done. Imagine telling a Spartan warrior to find the mean between bravery and cowardice during battle. You might end up with a helmet flung at your head. Despite the idealism of Aristotle's philosophies, they weren't entirely divorced from reality. He was acutely aware of the flaws in human nature, a fact that he integrated into his political theories. Aristotle recognized that not everyone could live a life of virtue, given the economic and social constraints of the time. His ideas about education and governance were attempts to elevate society as a whole, even if they were sometimes more aspirational than actionable. The economic realities of ancient Greece were a formidable backdrop for Aristotle's work. Money was a constant concern, and the need for stability in a sea of political unrest shaped his ideas. For instance, Take his emphasis on the importance of property rights as a foundation for stability. In a city where wealth dictated power, ensuring the protection of property was not just a philosophical stance, but a political necessity. His belief that a strong middle class was crucial for stable governance was rooted in this economic understanding, even if the execution of such ideas was about as straightforward as a labyrinth. But let's not romanticize Aristotle as some kind of ancient economic sage. His ideas were very much a product of their time, and while they resonate today, they also reflect a worldview where hierarchy and inequality were accepted norms. His endorsement of the natural order might have resonated with the elite, but the average Greek citizen, perhaps struggling to pay their debts or secure their daily bread, might have viewed Aristotle's theories with a healthy dose of skepticism. Aristotle's philosophies, while groundbreaking, were not immune to the challenges and contradictions of the real world. His attempt to reconcile idealism with practicality often led to conclusions that, although visionary, were not always feasible in the economic and political climate of his time. Yet, his work laid the foundation for future discourse on ethics and governance, sparking debates that continue to this day. In the grand tapestry of history, Aristotle stands as a figure who dared to dream big, even when the world around him seemed content with the status quo. His ideas were both a reflection of his era and a challenge to it, a testament to the enduring struggle between the ideal and the real. As we ponder the implications of his work, we're reminded that while the world may change, the questions he posed remain as relevant as ever. So, as we prepare to delve further into Aristotle's legacy and the impact of his teachings, remember this. His philosophies were not just abstract musings, but a bold attempt to understand the complexities of human existence. In a world where the only constant was change, Aristotle sought to find the constants in human nature, a quest that continues to inspire and provoke thought centuries later. And with that, we leave Aristotle in his Lyceum, a philosopher in perpetual motion, ever seeking, ever questioning, and always pushing the boundaries of what it means to be human. As we leave Aristotle in his Lyceum, a philosopher in perpetual motion, ever seeking, ever questioning, and always pushing the boundaries of what it means to be human, we find ourselves on the precipice of his twilight years, a period less celebrated and more fraught with the kind of drama that would make even a Greek tragedy blush. Aristotle, ever the intellectual juggernaut, was not immune to the capricious whims of fate or the political turbulence of his time. This is where the tale takes a turn from the soaring heights of philosophical discourse to the sobering realities of an aging thinker navigating a world that wasn't always kind to its sages. By the time we hit 322 BC, Aristotle was dealing with more than just the weighty tomes of philosophy. He was facing a political climate about as stable as a sandcastle at high tide. Athens, a city that had once been the epicenter of intellectual activity, was now embroiled in a wave of anti-Macedonian sentiment. This was the fallout from Alexander the Great's death in 323 BC, which left a power vacuum the size of a Macedonian phalanx. The Athenians were in no mood for subtlety. They wanted a scapegoat, and Aristotle, with his close ties to the Macedonian court, was a prime target. Imagine being one of the most brilliant minds of the era, only to find yourself on the wrong side of the political divide. It's a bit like being the smartest kid in detention. No matter how clever you are, you're still in trouble. And trouble came knocking for Aristotle in the form of a charge of impiety. Yes, impiety, that catch-all accusation the Athenians loved to fling whenever they needed to knock someone down a peg. It was the ancient equivalent of a bad Yelp review, but with far more dire consequences. So, what's a philosopher to do when faced with the prospect of a trial that could end in exile, or worse? Aristotle, pragmatic as ever, chose discretion over valor. He fled to Chalcis, a town on the island of Euboea, where the political climate was notably less hostile. There he sought refuge, perhaps with a wry acknowledgement that even a philosopher needs to know when to fold him. Aristotle reportedly remarked that he left Athens to prevent the city from sinning twice against philosophy, a nod to the fate of Socrates, who had been sentenced to death on similar charges a few decades earlier. In Chalcis, Aristotle's life slowed down, but the mind that had once dissected the cosmos and catalogued species didn't simply shut off. Even in exile, he continued to write and ponder the intricacies of the natural world. It's said that he took solace in the rhythms of life on the island, possibly finding in its quieter pace a chance to reflect on a life spent in relentless pursuit of knowledge. But time, as it does to all, was catching up with Aristotle. Health issues plagued him, and in 322 BC, the philosopher succumbed to a stomach ailment, possibly an ulcer, an ignoble end for a man whose thoughts had once soared among the stars. But while Aristotle's life concluded in relative obscurity, his legacy was just beginning to unfurl. The survival of Aristotle's works is a story as labyrinthine as his philosophies. Unlike his contemporaries, whose writings were polished, published, and circulated, much of what we know of Aristotle comes from notes and lecture transcripts compiled by his students. These were not the polished essays we might imagine, but rather the intellectual equivalent of a rough draft, a testament to the fact that even geniuses need editors. Fast forward a few centuries, and it was the Islamic scholars of the Middle Ages who played a vital role in preserving and translating Aristotle's works. In the bustling intellectual centers of the Islamic Golden Age, Aristotle's ideas were not only preserved, but expanded upon, paving the way for the Renaissance thinkers in Europe. It's a delicious irony that the philosopher who spent much of his life categorizing the world was himself categorized, studied, and reinterpreted by scholars across cultures and continents. Now, let's tackle the elephant in the room, the romanticized image of Aristotle, the philosopher king of thought. It's easy to get swept up in the grandeur of his intellectual achievements, but let's not forget the realities. Here's a man who, despite his brilliance, was deeply embedded in the politics and prejudices of his time. His views on natural slavery, for instance, make modern audiences cringe. Sure, he was a pioneer in many areas, but he also had blind spots the size of a Macedonian empire. Aristotle's impact on modern thought is undeniable, yet it's crucial to approach his legacy with a discerning eye. He was a product of his age, navigating its complexities with the tools he had. His work laid the groundwork for scientific inquiry, political theory, and ethical reasoning, fields that continue to grapple with the questions he posed. His concept of teleology, the idea that everything has a purpose, is still a cornerstone in debates about the nature of existence. So, where does that leave us, the modern descendants of a philosophical giant, perhaps with the recognition that Aristotle was neither a saint nor a villain, but a man striving to make sense of the world in an era that was as chaotic as it was fascinating. His life reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge is a journey fraught with challenges and contradictions, yet it's a journey worth undertaking. In the end, Aristotle's story is not just about the triumphs of intellect, but also the humbling realities of human existence. It's about the messy, imperfect process of understanding, where the questions we ask are often more important than the answers we find. And as we close the book on this chapter of history, let's do so with a nod to the philosopher who dared to dream big, even when the world seemed determined to keep him small. And that, dear friends, is a legacy as enduring as the stars Aristotle once gazed upon.